Hello, Governor.
I'm Tony Two-Tone, and welcome back to my Top 100 RPGs series, where I cover the top 100 RPGs. You should all know the drill by now. If not, it is quite literally in the title. Playing the top 100 RPGs of all time as predicated by IGN. Normally I have some jabbering and gibberish I go through at the beginning, so let's just get that out of the way. I have been looking and inspecting this beauty of a tier list that I've created from all the games I've played on the channel, ranked in order of enjoyment, and I gotta say, some thoughts have changed. Not a lot, I stand by a lot of it, but some of it could use a tweak. After playing roughly 24 games for the channel, I have slightly changed 3 opinions. Whether this is the passing of time, nostalgia hitting ridiculously early, or just the act of playing more games and broadening my horizons and expanding my tastes and opinions, 3 have changed. First up is KOTOR. I even knew at the time that a score of B- was brutal, but I think just the hype around this game compared to the experience I had soured it a bit. Looking back, I think B- is too harsh. I think middle of the pack for B is a better fit for my opinions on this game, so I'd put it there. Ironically, its placement inside the tier does not change, but my view on it has gotten slightly better. Next up is another game that technically increases its ranking, but once again does not move within the tier list. That would be The Witcher 3. I don't know why I put this at S-. I think it was more so to fill up an empty slot in the letter grade rankings, but the more I think upon this game, the more I realize how fucking great it is. Just so much to offer, and sure, a bit can get repetitive and the progression system is quite lacking, but everything else it has to offer so vastly makes up for its shortcomings. I'm going to change it to S tier. Again, within the tier list it will not move an inch, but I am changing its score to S rather than S-, which will impact how other games are ranked around it. Finally, the third change, also being the only change that will affect its tier ranking and position, and that's Final Fantasy VI. At its core, it's a basic RPG system with not too much to offer in terms of progression and gameplay, but just the presentation, my favorite soundtrack of any game I have covered on this channel, one of the best stories, arguably the best villain I've encountered so far, leads Final Fantasy VI to just be an all-time great, worthy of the S tier. I would bump it up to the very bottom of the S tier and give it a grade of S-. So here is the tier list so far with those changes, the only noticeable one being Final Fantasy VI. Take a second to look at that, to gaze upon it, to feast your eyes on it, if you will. Also, I will reserve the beginning of future top 100 RPG videos for any changes I may or may not make. Without further ado, let's dive into the games, starting with number 16.
16号
Deus Ex. Deus Ex is an immersive sim / first-person cyberpunk RPG developed by Ion Storm and published. I got a hiccup. Deus Ex is an immersive sim / first-person cyberpunk RPG developed by Ion Storm and published by Eidos Interactive in the year 2000 for computer platforms. Deus Ex was directed by Warren Spector, arguably, or not really because you'd be wrong to argue, the father of the immersive sim genre. He worked on essential games to birth this genre, like Ultima Underworld, System Shock, and Thief. Nowadays, immersive sim has kind of lost its meaning, as nearly all of our concepts of a first-person RPG are pretty much immersive sims, like Skyrim or even recently Kingdom Come. But there was a time where the mindset of allowing the player to interact with their complete environment and the ability of the game to shape around the actions of the player was completely brand new and unique. And to be honest, it still is. As years later, this design philosophy of allowing complete freedom on the part of the player is rarely done as well and efficiently as these precursor titles. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take a step back and just talk about Deus Ex. As far as my personal familiarity with Deus Ex, all I really knew it from was the vast amount of video essays on YouTube covering this game. Also, the knowledge that Elon Musk used to have the main character of this game as his avatar on Twitter, which quite honestly is just fucking brutal PR for this game. But as we know now, I don't think Elon can tell the meaning of video games or tell his toe from his fucking asshole through all that ketamine. However, there's a reason that JC Denton was his profile pick, even if its meaning flew over his coke-filled brain, and that's because of what Deus Ex represents. Oh yeah, baby, the Deep State. Outside of its video game relevance for being one of the peak immersive sim games, Deus Ex has sort of a cultural relevance because of the political story it tells. In my, what a story it is. So with that out of the way, let's actually dive into that story.
I'm not gonna stand here and listen to you badmouth the greatest democracy the world has ever known.
In Deus Ex, you play as JC Denton, a hilariously action hero-coded, cybernetically enhanced secret agent who works for an international organization known as UNATCO. They're pretty much the international police in charge of stopping terrorism. You start the game infiltrating the Statue of Liberty to catch quote-unquote terrorists known as the NSF, who have taken the statue over and captured a container of ambrosia. Ambrosia is a cure for the ongoing disease ravaging the entire world known as the Great Death.
Literally COVID?
Yes, that is why Elon made JC Denton his profile pic. Because you see, the Great Death is actually a man-made disease used for control of the plebeians, the sheeple, the general populace, and JC Denton has been unknowingly aiding those in power. This has led to the perpetuation of the cycle of quelling the masses by acting as an arm of the higher-ups through his work at UNATCO. Interestingly enough, the idea behind Deus Ex is taking every single conspiracy theory and saying, I don't know, what if this shit is true? And to be entirely blunt, I do think in a way this game was ahead of its time. Not in the way that Elon might agree with, but in an entirely different manner. There's a surprising amount of topics that are relevant to this day, and not in the general manner that many of these RPGs are, with themes such as war bad, but in a more precise sort of way. For example, I stumbled upon a newspaper clipping in Deus Ex that described the process of an ongoing meme war, in which groups spread emails and pamphlets lampooning the government, using jokes and media to push a less noticeable form of propaganda. I'd like to have a propaganda of JC Cybercock, if you know what I'm saying. Now, does this precisely mean your grandpa posting a Russian-made meme about triggering libtards? No. But the mapping of ideas of fighting a soft power-fueled battle in the eye of public opinion is something that happens in the current political landscape. Sure, this is not necessarily a new phenomenon. I mean, honestly, this was as relevant in 2000 as it is now in 2025, and probably will also be in 2050, but it is still quite impressive as to how well it has held up. On top of that, it still does not undercut the way in which Deus Ex uses these themes to build on this futuristic nightmare of cybernetic society on the brink of collapse. Another great example of tying political generations together is alluding to Hong Kong being a haven for techno-piracy, which, ironically enough, China is still pretty well known for, and it was even back in 2000. But anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. Back to the main story. So we find out the truth about Ambrosia, and we discover our brother, who is also a cyber agent for UNATCO, has been a mole the entire time, helping the NSF terrorist group because of the info he found out, which is that the Grey Death is a bioweapon, and UNATCO is purposefully withholding the cure from the people. From here, you go on a wild goose chase down the rabbit hole of conspiracy in this politically fueled power vacuum all the way down to one of the most interesting conclusions I have seen for a video game. This ending relies on siding with one of 3 factions to determine your specific ending, but it's much more complex than that may sound. I think the way in which it covers each faction throughout the game is done in a mature and even-keeled way. It would be super easy to make the quote-unquote Illuminati we encounter shadowy evil bad guys who destroy the lives of everyday citizens as they laugh upon their comically large stack of $100 bills, but they're not quite like that. Sure, they are a power-hungry group that may continue this downward spiral into economic and political collapse, but they also have just as much interest in maintaining the well-being of society, and in turn the status quo. Besides the Majestic 12 and Bob Page, who I will get to, there are no real bad guys or good guys in terms of factions you can align with. Of course, the villains that pop up throughout your exploits are pretty comically evil. The actual groups you interact with are complex, with shadowy motives but seemingly good intentions. The Triads and Tracer Tong are in the self-interest of burning it all down so it can be rebuilt. But is that the best option for humanity? The status quo seems not great, but is it better than an AI-backed god making decisions for what it dictates as the best course for society? That seems pretty fucking terrifying. But could the potential of utopia be worth the risk? This web of ideas and concepts is perfectly spun and makes your head swirl thinking about the possibilities of everything this world could lead to. However, even as good as this story is, it does have a few weak points. Number 1 is the villain. This is the evil, shadowy CEO billionaire who is just out for himself, which is just such a boring main villain. Actually, wait, that reminds me of someone. Bob Page just doesn't have much going on, rather than being super evil and having pretty great voice acting, admittedly. Also, for as much deserved credit as this game gets for being topical even to this day, it also has plenty of misses that just aren't talked about. This actually ties into a critique I have with actual conspiracy theorists who will throw everything at the wall, and if even one of these things maps onto a semblance of reality, they will proclaim, "Conspiracy theorists were right about everything," while ignoring the hundreds of hours of nonsense spewed that gets overlooked. Cue the Joe Rogan Alex Jones clip.
He's right a lot of the time.
He's right most of the time,
yeah.
except that one big one. But other than that,
Alex Jones has been found guilty on all 4 defamation cases brought by families of those killed in the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School.
Sure, Deus Ex predicted many things, but that does not make this game some sort of oracle or even a serious map onto our reality. There's a section where you fight little gray alien men in Area 51. That's not a joke. You actually do that. And I think the silliness and over-the-top presentation of Deus Ex's story gets a little lost in the conversation. Don't get me wrong, I think this has more to do with the conversing around the game rather than the game itself, as it is pretty obvious that this game is tongue-in-cheek, and if you approach it from this point of view, you will be better off for it. But if you treat this as some serious representation of our actual world, then you might be a little lost in the sauce. Just enjoy it for what it is. A fictional reality that tells an interesting tale by using a heaping plethora of real-life conspiracies from all sides of the political aisle. And I do mean that. Normally when the phrase politically neutral gets thrown around, I cringe, but this game could easily be read as right-wing, left-wing, libertarian, communist, anarchist, or fascist, depending on what you choose to focus on in the story. There's such an intricacy with a fantastic balance that I do have to applaud despite leading to some of the most brain-rotted conversations I've encountered about a game online. But it's still an impressive story that will stick with me far beyond the ending credits.
Do you have a single fact to back that up?
Now for the presentation. I think Deus Ex snuck right into the perfect timing with early 2000s graphics. This fits more comfortably with the Vagrant story side of the spectrum that relies on mixing early 3D models with actual 2D sprites, leading to a really appealing look to this game. Not saying it has aged well or anything like that, but there are other types of games like KOTOR in the early 2000s who focused far too heavily on early 3D graphics, and thus have aged like milk. This game is filled to the brim with gorgeous skyboxes like New York City and beautiful locations like the futuristic city of Hong Kong. What do you want me to do? You set a cyberpunk-esque game in Hong Kong and expect me to not fucking feel like the Blade Runner? This game has such a charm to it that I truly did not expect. That opening cutscene damn near made my eyes bleed, but that initial shock of graphics soon gave way to the extreme immersion this game was able to pull off despite being aged. My biggest complaint with this game is how absolutely gobsmack fucking dark it is. Holy. You were given a battery to use for your cybernetics, and I swear to God, I used over 3/4 of my lifetime battery on the flashlight just because every location was so dark. I was like 2 inches from the screen, squinting to maybe make out the shadow of an enemy. This game also boasts voice acting, which I haven't really had to cover until my coverage of newer games, but this one holds up surprisingly well. It does so because it is so obviously going for schlock that I love. JC Denton has this hilarious delivery that's so deadpan, yet it just works. I would find myself just impersonating JC because of his iconic delivery and great one-liners. Do you have a single fact to back that up? Oh man, I just loved it. All other voice actors do an equally great job, and it gives this game the same vibe as one of those great 90s movies that's unabashedly cheesy. Well, except for some of the Hong Kong NPCs, which are...
How we all feeling? Yeah, boy! Did you know that China and Japan are actually different countries? Oh, really?
Also just dug this techno-futuristic vibe of the game. Despite the cyberpunk/Blade Runner universe being one of the coolest settings in media, we have a deviously small amount of games set there, especially in the RPG genre. I mean sure, obviously there's Cyberpunk 2077 and Shadowrun, but think of how many fucking RPGs have settings either directly based in or off of D&D/Lord of the Rings. I know it has a lot to do with copyright and whatnot, but still, there are a tragic few amount of games at least inspired by the universe, and that doesn't have to directly copy it, like Deus Ex, which is obviously inspired by the setting, but has its own unique bureaucratic twist on it with the punky edge sanded off a bit, with a dash of X-Files for good measure. Speaking of which, let's now talk about the soundtrack. I think it's decent. The main theme slaps, and UNATCO Ambient might be some of my favorite synth-y, futuristic tracks in a video game. My only problem is the rest of the soundtrack falls too heavily in the stereotypical quote-unquote future feel, with every track being dominated by synths or synth bass / minor electronic influences. Ironically, I think some of the best sci-fi soundtracks are the ones that stray away from these typical tropes. Not to beat a dead horse, but think about the Blade Runner soundtrack from Vangelis, who utilizes jazz instrumentation, a heavy dose of ambient music, and sure, good old synthwave, but much more sparingly. Or think of Cyberpunk 2077, which goes fully into techno, even crossing into hardcore hip-hop territory on occasion. These have distinct identities, and I just find that Deus Ex kind of lacks a distinct identity with its soundtrack. Again, not saying it's bad, I'm just saying there feels like missed potential for an all-timer. As far as how characters look in their designs, I absolutely adore it. Gunther and Anna have such a Terminator feel to them, and their cybernetics stand out so distinctly in the bureaucratic environments we often find them in. And my god, if it weren't for Columbine, that trenchcoat JC is reppin' would be an all-timer. Okay, maybe more Matrix than Columbine, but still, point stands. Also, just the fact that this game is so fucking dark, yet JC is rocking sunglasses the entire time just feels so on brand that I don't even care about the logistics of it. Actually, now I'm thinking about it, maybe that's why the game's so goddamn dark, because we're seeing it through the lens of a man wearing sunglasses the entire time. Even the lesser NPCs always look pretty fly for some white guys, and I absolutely love the looks of each and every character. I thought the enemy variety was just okay. Not a single one that blew me away, but there were plenty of cool designs, and actually a decent amount of variation that any critique I have falls to the wayside. All in all, despite being from maybe the most poorly aged era of graphics, I think the presentation is great, and more importantly, it's distinct. There is truly no game I've played so far that feels like Deus Ex.
I'm not much into books.
Now we chug along to progression. In the progression section, I think it's time to discuss an elephant in the room present for my playthrough. Deus Ex was the 16th game I played for this Top 100 RPG series. In all my time, I've done them chronologically, so I did 1 first, then 2, down the line. Deus Ex frustrated me so much, I put it down. Completed numbers 17, 18, 19, and 20 before coming back to it, number 16, Deus Ex. Let me explain. In gaming, I have always hated stealth. I hate it, I hate it, I hate it. I hated it from one of the first games I ever beat, Legends of Zelda Twilight Princess, to one of my favorite games of the year, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. There is a game called Styx that I picked up solely because the main character is a goblin. It is well on record how much I love goblins, so having a smart-mouthed, vulgar goblin be the character you play was a match made in heaven for me. To this day, I have never gotten past the first level because of how much I despise stealth, so much so that even a perfect goblin main character cannot overcome this hurdle. However, that was many moons ago, but I'm an adult now. I like mushrooms in my pasta and pussy on my breath, so I thought I would give stealth a try. Bad decision, hombre. Who could have guessed forcing myself to play the game in a way I hate would lead to an awful experience, I know. The main reason I tried this approach is because of the setting of Deus Ex. I'm a police officer, an agent of UNATCO. Police don't use force, which yeah, cool, I can get behind that. I don't want to be fucking Derek Chauvin. That was out of pocket. But this approach of pacifism just was not for me. I used stealth up until the second zone, where I got 3/4 of the way through, got stuck and said, yup, I'm a dip. Made a judgment call and moved on to the next game. By the time I circled back, I decided I was going to play the way I wanted to. Instead of playing this game how I thought it wanted to be played, I said, screw it, we do it my way, and I met Deus Ex in the middle. This change was like night and day. I played Deus Ex like it was fucking Call of Duty, and I love this approach. I feel a little bad because there were so many systems that I just didn't interact with because of my shoot first, ask questions later mentality. But then I realized, that's the beauty of this game. If you want to be a super sleuth spy, there are enough systems here to keep you entertained in trying that approach. On the complete opposite side of the spectrum, if you're a bumbling, impatient bozo like myself, you can run and gun your way through the entire story, and both approaches are equally viable and valid. Now let's actually tackle the progression. In Deus Ex, you don't really level up. You first create your character by choosing what skills you want to be efficient in and leveling up that way. So there are no real character levels, but more rather skill levels. The beauty in this game is that you could probably beat the game without leveling up a single skill. These skills just make your life easier in the approaches you most commonly take. Want to be a stealthy cyber ninja? Level up electronics, computer, and melee. Want to pretend Deus Ex is Halo? Follow my build and only level up guns and melee, baby. It is truly astounding how open and free this game is, where legitimately any build can work. This leads me to the level design, which is phenomenal. Like many immersive sims, the objectives within each mission can often be simple. For example, get into a certain building. The beauty in immersive sims is how you get there, and providing ample ways of doing this. In this game, you can simply put down an explosive and blow up the door. If you're strong enough, you can just bust it down with a melee weapon. If you have enough lockpicks, you can unlock it. Maybe there's a window that you can stack crates up to in order to get in that way. Maybe you just kill everyone on sight and find the key on a body. Sure, at the end of the day, you have just accomplished a single objective, but the beauty in Deus Ex is the story of how you did it. The map designs also just have so many nooks and crannies that, if explored, can lead to even more possibilities. Sometimes you find passwords to computers or entire alternate routes like Area 51, where I could not get past the entrance. Explored and found a vent system that allowed me to bypass the massive mechs guarding the compound. Every map has some sort of secret like this, and most importantly, a cost benefit to these routes. Do you really want to use 4 electronic lockpicks to get to this new area, which could lead to nothing? This strain on resources causes you to weigh all options and decide the best route to take. Same goes for ammo. Towards late game, you run low on ammo, so every shot counts. This forced me to use new guns I had hardly touched, interact with systems I didn't expect to, and rethink approaches. Which leads me to your augmentations. Augmentations are cybernetics you can equip and use throughout your missions that do a plethora of different things. The main one I used was the healing ability and that goddamn flashlight, but I would occasionally use the melee boosting one. To get augmentations, you have to find canisters hidden around each level and take them to an upgrade center where you choose between 2 different options of what you want that augmentation to become. As I said, I didn't use this one much, but there are many unique upgrades that could be game changers, like drones you could use as distractions or even invisibility cloaking. All of these have to be activated, and using them while activated drains your limited battery. This is just another example of an entire progression system I hardly interacted with just because of my choice of approach. But if you enjoy being stealthy, this very well could be your bread and butter. Deus Ex just inundates you with options, and that is what makes progressing through Deus Ex so fantastic. The final topic I want to cover in this section is story progression. One of the key aspects I like so much about Deus Ex is its reactivity. Sure, the numerous approaches are great, but just as importantly is the world's reactivity to these choices. For example, early on you are paired with Ana Navarra to clear a zone. Ana is a bloodthirsty cyborg who loves direct force. The first time I played, I completed this mission without killing any of the NSF terrorists, and when Ana reported to my superior, she basically called me a fucking pussy. In my reset playthrough, since I played every mission like I was Rambo, during that same report she was like, "This guy's the fucking GOAT, dude. Bro takes no prisoners." This is just one example of many. Just about every conversation has some reference to a previous action or choice, including many of which you didn't even know you were making. One of the shining highlights of my experience in Deus Ex is your brother Paul Denton. Spoiler ahead, so tread with caution. In my playthrough, Paul Denton dies. This is referenced throughout the game. I see his corpse and tell his lover his fate through an emotional conversation. Not for a single second did I know all of this was optional. Apparently, there was one section of the game where I escaped through a window rather than the door that triggered his death, and Paul could be alive for the entire game if I went a different route. The main reason I only discovered this fact until after I beat the game is due to how reactive the world is, and it portrays every slight change as almost being canon. There were no odd signs or dropped quests or anything that would even indicate that Paul didn't have to die. It just felt natural. This game is fantastic with its reactivity, rivaled only by the likes of Baldur's Gate 3 or Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. The advantage Deus Ex had was it was made more than 20 years prior to both of these. Just a phenomenal progression system all the way around.
He was a good man. What a rotten way to die.
Now for combat. Considering I played this game with only combat, rarely sneaking, I think I am the most qualified to give it It's fine. Guns don't particularly feel weighty, but using enough mods on each gun you have can at least make them powerful enough to get the job done. Combat is definitely the weakest aspect to this game, which is part of the reason I used a different approach the first time around. The only real satisfying thing to do in combat is getting a headshot, which always results in a kill. But other than that, there's not really much to it. I feel bad because this is going to be the shortest section, but like, what you see is what you get. Enemies are pretty bulky, but the weaknesses of headshots slightly compensates for this fact. At the beginning, a pistol is your best friend, but another annoying aspect of combat is the aiming system. It feels kinda dorky to use a scope for a pistol, but to aim without one requires pointing at an enemy for a rather extended period of time until the reticle becomes tighter. By the time your reticle becomes an appropriate size to actually hit a target, you've probably been spotted, leading it to feel super ineffective. Aspects like this and those previously mentioned are what led me to believe Deus Ex prefers to be played in a stealthy manner, and I still genuinely believe that. But with enough grit and grind, you can shoot your way through any zone, or make use of explosives, which I unfortunately disregarded until the end, where they slowly became my best friend. Melee weapons also just suck nuts. The only one worth any value is the Dragon Tooth Cyber Sword, which is sick and puts in work, but you get it so late that if you want to do melee otherwise, you're kind of stuck with trash until then. I'm sure with the right augmentation, you could probably make this work, but enemies move so sporadically and randomly that it's very difficult to hit a moving target, so your best bet is to use stealth if you want to use melee. Encounters/boss fights also can completely spread the gambit depending on what you have equipped or what ammo you possess. I tried just about every approach, but unfortunately the only correct one in every situation is the Gep gun. One taps every boss I encountered and melts mechs, making it genuinely the best gun in the game. Only held back by ammo supply and splash damage, which can result in death. I'm fucking running out of stuff to talk about. I guess health? Any damage you take is targeted to an area of your body, but this never affected me because even on normal difficulty, if you get spotted and ganged up on, you're gonna die. On top of that, the fact that you are filled to the brim with healing makes it that way this hardly ever affected me. But it is neat that getting hit repeatedly in your legs makes you walk slower or even crawl, or that hurting your arm could hurt your aim. It's just that this never truly messed with my build. I either died or healed immediately after combat, so that never really affected the way that I went through this game. Look, I'm out of shit to say. When I think back on Deus Ex, I'm never going to be like, man, what great combat. That's just the truth. It does just enough to get the job done, but definitely is not one of the better systems I've stumbled across.
That makes me one ugly son of a bitch.
Finally, let's cover the characters. First is JC Denton. Look, lock me up and throw away the key if it's illegal to think being a cyborg dude is cool. Yeah, I said it. Sue me. Cuck my wife. Do it. Fuck her in front of me. Make me watch. Force me to watch. I might even like it. I might even volunteer to do it. What are you gonna do about it, huh? Huh, viewer boy? Huh? I know I've already covered JC's voice and just his vibe, but I think he also works really well as a character. This archetype of cool superhero matched with self-realization that they're way too in over their head and have been lied to their entire life is great. Sure, JC is an emotional stalwart who never elaborates on how he feels, but playing the game as someone who's doing their best to right the wrongs of the government, despite being way out of the loop to what is actually going on, is endearing. Next is Paul Denton, your brother. He's fine. I didn't feel that connected to him, but that also might be because I allowed him to move on from this corporeal world of ours. Maybe having him alive for the entire game would have left more of an impact on me, but for what it stands, he just served as the delivery vehicle for the big twist of the game. Your UNATCO team is also fine. There is a camaraderie that was nice to feel with a lot of these characters, and seeing them each fall onto their respective factions that they think is right is a really interesting approach to take, but I didn't feel super invested into any single one of them. Sure, when they showed up, I was like, oh hey, that guy, nice. That's about it. And Navarre and Gunther are meh. Very obviously future boss fights, but they felt a bit cartoony to take seriously versus a character like Simons who occupies the same role but has a much more intimidating aura stemming from the fact he seems like one of the few who is in on it and carries himself as such. I've already talked about Paige. Cool design and all, but just silly, and not in the fun schlocky way, more of the boring, rehashed way. So now let's cover the factions and their leaders. Spoilers galore. First up is the Triad and Tracer Tong. I think Tracer Tong has the best personality and is easily one of the characters I would say definitively has the best interests of humanity. That is, until the very end where Tong from the top turnbuckle says he wants to destroy the communication network and launch the world into a new dark age. What? Why? It makes absolutely no sense, especially for someone like Tong who has been communicating with us via the internet from the very start. If you shut off the internet in real life, it would be crazy. Planes would fall out of the sky, trains would crash into one another, every economy on Earth would collapse. We'd turn into fucking Mad Max. That's for the real world, let alone this hyper-futuristic one that Deus Ex takes place in. Just seems like a really silly ending, and it would be hard to justify any ending in any video game ever where the burn it all down option feels like an appropriate one. Kinda soured my opinion on Tong, but for the rest of the game he is a reliable source who feels like a breath of fresh air in between all the undermining and politics at play. Also, just the zone where you find him, Hong Kong, is like one of my favorite parts of the entire game, with great side quests around Maggie Wong and the feuding triad gangs that it most definitely helps his case. Next is the Illuminati led by Morgan Everett. Everett has the arguably strongest case if I were to approach a decision like this in real life. He himself as a person is shady as all hell, but he does seemingly have the world's best interests in mind. But only because the world's best interests coincide with his best interests. He is very obviously implied to be just as power hungry as those before him, which led to the state of decay that the Deus Ex universe finds itself within. But at least it's a familiar one. The way Everett's story and background unwinds itself is probably the best, with his compound housing the supposed previous leader of the Illuminati who is trapped by Everett, which we think is going to be this huge gotcha to confront him with, but he kind of just shrugs it off. This implies a disconnected malice that Everett possesses within. But in the same conversation, we are planning on how to cure the Grey Death and stop Paige and the Majestic 12 from plunging the world into turmoil. He rides the line between benevolent and power-hungry extremely well, making a tough call to entrust the state of the world with him, even if you're by his side. Because I mean, look what happened to the other guy. Fucking know what I'm saying? Speaking of entrusting the world, the last faction. AI, or Daedalus. Well, Daedalus then Icarus. Well, Daedalus and Icarus and Helios, to be precise. Upon reaching the climax, I was so sure that this bozo would never get my vote for the ending. We see this program evolve and manifest itself through any means possible. Sometimes it can be helpful or sometimes it can be harmful, depending on where its interests lie. Helios is average? We've seen this character millions of times. I can't let you do that, Dave. Type beat, right? An AI program that has transcended mortal understanding. So when it requests to merge with your consciousness in order to rule over the world in the most calculated and pro-human way, it was very much, yeah bozo, see you later. But then that transmission came through that changed my entire viewpoint of the best ending. A part of Helios escaped and took over Hong Kong and in turn, kind of fixed it? Within a matter of minutes, it took a broken down, collapsed Hong Kong society and revived it with people stepping in line to abide by this new rule. At the end of the day, it is exactly what JC says, a benevolent dictator, but the reason I chose it is for simply one reason. The one thing that other endings didn't have. Hope. Sure, I might have just signed away the fate of humanity to ChatGPT and a computer with a potential god complex, but what if a utopia is created? I don't know. Techno God ending also just seemed like the best sci-fi ending of all time, so fuck it, we ball. Even if that might mean a Grok King. Wait, I made the wrong decision, didn't I?
Maybe you should try getting a job.
And with that, we have covered Deus Ex. What a journey. If you take anything away from this analysis, take away the fact that sometimes it is good to just put something down and come back to it in a better mindset. If I would have brute forced my way through this game the first go around, I would have trashed it and thrashed it. Allowing myself to reset and reapproach was the best decision I made. So how do I feel about Deus Ex now? If your special interests, fancy speak for autistic hyperfixations, align with this game, I can totally see how this could be a top 5 game. If someone were to even put this in the top 3, I wouldn't argue, versus something like KOTOR. If you put KOTOR there, I would point and laugh at you and call you nerd, and tell you that, brother, you're compromised, hop off the nostalgia. Deus Ex is different. The progression and story are both phenomenal and equally complex, and the systems at play within this game are one of a kind. However, I have to admit that whether I like it or not, I don't enjoy all these systems. Putting Deus Ex down, I realized I missed out on so much this game had to offer, and worse yet, I had no interest in pushing through to understand these systems. They are just frankly not for me. Deus Ex is the quintessential video game essay video game. Yes, I may be an essayist, but above all, I'm a gamer who did not enjoy this as much as I hoped, but can recognize its greatness, and I am still super happy to have played it. I'm going to settle on a B. Now, let's tackle the next game.
Numeris Septiniolica.
Suikoden 2. Suikoden 2? More like sweet fucking Zin, boo. Suikoden 2 is a JRPG released in 1998 for the PlayStation by Konami, who developed and published it. There is technically a small difference on exact publish date due to it being released at different times in Japan versus the US, so here I am referencing the original release date. Does anyone actually give a fuck? Not at all. Suikoden 2 was a rather disappointing release for Konami, with tepid sales and mediocre reception amongst critics for employing 16-bit graphics in a time when 3D was the new hot jazz. Since then, it has become a cult classic, and obviously, by its placement on this list, is now considered one of the best RPGs of all time, and some would argue, the best RPG of all time. As far as my previous experience with Suikoden 2 goes, I actually have played a bit of this game previously. Like just about every other game on this list that I've played previously, I never finished it. I got maybe 10 hours in on my first go around, and I wish I could say my crazy cool life led me to dropping it because of how crazy busy I was getting pussy in college, but the truth is I dropped it because I just was not feeling it. However, that was many moons ago, in days past, so I was excited to give it a complete and fair shot, and thus, with it coming up on the list, here we are. There are 4 different ways to play Suikoden 2 nowadays. One being on an original PlayStation with an original game cart. One is emulating it, which is totally fine, because if you're doing this, then you definitely own a PlayStation physical copy of Suikoden 2, and you just dumped the files on your computer, obviously. Another is on the Suikoden 1 and 2 compilation, which released for the PSP exclusively in Japan, or you can play how I did, which is with the 2025 Suikoden 1 and 2 HD Remaster Gate, Rune, and Dunin Unification Wars, which is available on all platforms. The difference between the original and this new remaster are rather minimal, which is genuinely how I prefer these remasters to be. It just added a nice graphical update that doesn't upend the original beautiful pixel art, and just includes some quality of life features like removing the unnecessarily impeding in-world timer. With all of that out of the way, let's dive into the world of Suikoden 2. The story of Suikoden 2 takes place between the 2 nations of Highland in the city-states of Joustin, we'll call them. We play as Ryu, a young lad who starts the game off as being a member of the Highland Army Youth Brigade. However, during our time with this youth brigade, we are betrayed by their heir to Highland, Luca Blight, who betrays his own people and orchestrates a false flag attack in order to justify a full-on war with the city-states. For those who don't dip their hairy little toes into geopolitics, a false flag is an attack on one's own citizenry or infrastructure under disguise in order to lay blame on another party or nation. An example of this is by General Saishiro Itagaki, who was a general for Japan in 1931, who sabotaged a railway in Japan in order to rationalize the invasion and taking over of Manchuria. Due to Suikoden 2 being a Japanese-made game, this very well could have influenced the inclusion of a false flag operation in the plot, but also, false flags are not necessarily a Japanese-only event, as those of us beautiful blue-blooded Americans have a few of those of our own, most notably with the Bay of Pigs incident. Point is, who the fuck knows and who the fuck cares? I talk about the history within video games, not unimportant topics like fucking actual history. So back to the plot. Ryu and his best friend Jowie successfully escaped this mass murder event by jumping from a nearby cliff into the river below with a vow to meet once shit has settled down. From here we follow Ryu as he navigates his way into a mercenary army fighting under the banner of the city-states and against the evil Prince Luca in order to bring peace back to the land. So how do I feel about the plot? Good fucking question. Like many other aspects about Suikoden 2, everything in the kitchen sink is thrown at you, so the better question is what sticks and what doesn't. I think this game and its story is at its best when it tackles themes of war and interpersonal conflict between one's loyalty to their nation and one's loyalty to themselves and those they care about. Bringing together and building this originally mercenary army into something worthy of protecting the realm is great. And when the story broaches the topic of war, I never felt like it was tackling it in the typical war is hell way. I mean, sure, there's a little of that, but I also think it handles it in a much more mature lens. For example, it's really easy to lay down a blanket war is bad, but Suikoden 2 acknowledges that while this may be true, sometimes war is necessary. I think there's a great scene in here where the citizens of a certain city fight off Luca's army to protect their leader, despite their leader pleading to let her surrender in order to quell the violence. While sure, maybe this could potentially spare some bloodshed, Suikoden addresses the fact that despite this cruel fact, some things are worth shedding blood for, and I found this just rather refreshing in a JRPG. Obviously, Suikoden 2 is not the only RPG to approach themes like this, as we'll talk about 2 more coming up in this video. I still think the way it handled this specific idea was great. Sometimes death and despair is necessary to stop an evil force like Luca Blight, a Hitler-esque figure, which, Upon saying out loud, "It's pretty rich coming from you, Japan. Quick refresher, whose side were you on in World War II? Record of world wars aside, undefeated." Let's tackle another terrific aspect of Suikoden 2's story, Luca Blight. Luca is such a fantastic villain. I have stated before, I don't mind the comically evil archetype for a villain, as long as it is done well. My favorite villain so far has been Kefka, who's just a maniacal, crazy psychopath. That's all there is to him. But I don't care, because of how well it is portrayed and delivered to the player. Luca Blight occupies similar territory, being a truly disturbed individual who does some pretty fucked up things. What also helps build his aura is how the rest of his army behaves. For the most part, other generals are pretty even-headed and rational, and recognize how out of control Luca is, but are forced to talk in the shadows about how crazy he is, out of fear of what Luca might do to them. This dichotomy shows off how much power and control Luca is able to maintain due entirely to his strength and unpredictability. It really is great. And that boss fight against him is genuinely like a top 3 boss I have talked about on this channel. A tough fight that requires 3 separate teams just to weaken him and finally whittle him down and beat him. So you must think, what a great ending to a game that must have been, right? Right? Well, my little bullfrog, you would not be wrong to think that this is what should have been the final boss, but it's not. It's essentially the halfway point of the game. Why do so many fucking games do this? Getting pretty sick of it, to be honest. Which is a perfect segue to my many issues with the story. First and foremost is the juggling of tones. Suikoden 2 sucks at this. Many powerful moments and just the entire tone of the game is dragged down so hard by the stupid anime-isms littered throughout the game. The stupid tropes and unseriousness of our characters in many scenes leads to this all feeling like a lighthearted romp rather than a serious ongoing war. Not saying this game can't have any brevity, but turn it down a couple notches. Luca Blight is our villain. Why are we doing like fucking slapstick comedy in like the very next scene? The reason why Luca works so well is because he is treated with appropriate seriousness. Every other part of the game feels like it lacks any stakes because of this easygoing tone permeating the entire runtime. Last thing I want to address is the supernatural aspect that rears its ugly mug throughout the game. I'm not talking about the magic or the runes we see, these are pretty typical in an RPG, but like the literal fucking Bela Lugosi Dracula boss that we face multiple times. To face this Saturday-ass cartoon villain who sucks up the power vacuum after Luca's death feels like a slap to the face, and even worse, destroys a plot that could have been interesting. Addressing the question of, spoilers for a damn near 30-year-old game, Jowy's betrayal, and with the death of Luca, figuring out what the fuck we're even fighting for anymore could have been such an interesting direction to take the second half of the game. But no, instead we fight fucking zombies and Count Chocula himself. This sucked, and the Rune Wolf boss thing also sucked as a final boss. With all of these ups and downs in terms of interest and quality, it's tough to definitively say whether or not I enjoyed the entire product Suikoden 2 provided in terms of story. And unfortunately, this may be a trend going throughout. One thing I can definitively say I loved is the presentation. My god, this game looks gorgeous. While I don't remember much from my first playthrough of Suikoden 2, I do remember even back then noting how detailed and beautiful sprites appeared and moved. It all looks so smooth and seamless, and better yet, just about every one of the 108 recruitable companions, yes, 108, we will get to that, have completely unique animations that aren't reused. It gives Suikoden 2 such a unique feel and vibe, even within the pixel graphics loaded genre of JRPGs. It's quite funny looking back at how critical the use of pixel graphics was when Suikoden 2 came out, considering the look of 3D graphics at the time and how those have held up. I mean, dog, look at this garbage. This choice to keep with 2D, while maybe harming it in the short term, paid off oodles in the long term and has led to one of, if not the best looking pixel game I have played. The amount of care and attention given to the sprite work is astounding, with so many mundane and seemingly unimportant interactions given entirely unique animations that would normally be saved for cutscenes in other pixel-bit era games. Genuinely, I'm running out of synonyms to properly display how good Suikoden 2's pixel art is. I also think enemy designs look quite nice, with scores of little freaks and ghouls to pick favorites from, and the character design is quite detailed and memorable, which is pretty important since that's about all there is to them. Bosses look great, and despite many not holding any narrative weight, they still become memorable due to their design and animations. Villages and locations are also given the same care and treatment, with each environment and vista looking as great as the last, but still, even these pale to the absurdly well done animations of battle and combat. It really does turn a rather run-of-the-mill combat system into so much more due to how good battles look and feel. Sound design is something I rarely mention, but the punchiness and oomph to some of these attacks you pull off are so memorable and iconic. That twirl whoosh of Ryo's weapons when attacking is imprinted into my koala brain. And how about that soundtrack, huh? While I don't stand on the aisle of people that think this is one of the best RPG soundtracks of all time, I quite liked a vast majority of it. Every theme, every melody is masterfully composed, and it never felt like a track was off or detracted from the scene. My biggest complaint is just that it feels too JRPG-y, if that makes sense. Like, it's about what I'd imagine for a JRPG soundtrack, but that doesn't make it any less pleasant or appealing to listen to, just rather in line with JRPG soundtracks of the time. Although I do have to say, I think Suikoden 2 might have my favorite battle theme. It's so intense and so upbeat, which serves as great contrast to the rest of the music and leads to battles never feeling boring, even if the combat is. I cannot overstate how much heavy lifting the presentation does, rivaled only by the likes of the ungodly carry job of Secret of Mana's presentation. You'll come to find I'm not the biggest fan of the combat system here, but without this godlike presentation, I would be even harsher, and really, the presentation is what has stood the test of time with Suikoden 2. I could try to rack my brain on some other aspect of the presentation I didn't absolutely love in order to extend this section, but I would be grasping at straws, and I would rather not. Truly, all the praise I've extended does not even cover the half of it in terms of the quality of Suikoden 2's visual presentation. Now for the progression. It's pretty whatever, to be completely honest. If you have played a single JRPG in your life, you know exactly what to expect. Each level, your stats increase and you grow slightly stronger. Rinse and repeat ad nauseum. The unique twist Suikoden 2 tries to wrench in is the rune system. These runes allow the chosen character to use or perform specific actions unique to that rune. For example, the elemental runes you equip provide some sort of magic that the character can use and unlock. However, this is not quite as open as, say, the Materia system in Final Fantasy VII, where any character can cover any role. In that game, you can make any single companion a mage just by equipping the right materia, even if they are not the best suited for it. In Suikoden 2, only certain companions even have a rune slot in order to equip them, and of this selection, they are further hampered by not being able to use any and every rune. This leads to an obvious separation between companions, as the best companions are the ones that can actually equip and use runes, and those that have multiple rune slots to take advantage of. Most of the heavy hitters and best companions for combat in this game are the few specific ones that meet this criteria. There is another slight twist to this formula in that some characters have their own specific rune that is only usable by them. For example, Ryu is the only one who can use the Bright Shield rune. Millie uses the Groundhog rune to unleash her hamster beast hybrid thing. Zamza uses the Fire Dragon rune to do like a flame uppercut. You get the gist. While these may be cute little gimmicks, there's not really any that outperform the best regular runes, except maybe Ryu's, but that's entirely due to main character syndrome, and is the exception, not the rule. You can also equip some runes onto weapons to give them added effects, but again, this just equates to a little extra damage in most cases, rather than a strategical add-on that you have to heavily contemplate. Gear and equipment is fine. Again, just kind of typical ones that boost a certain stat and increase defenses. I really wish there was more to the progression system when it comes to combat, but there's really not much else to say. It is all pretty linear, and any optimization there is to be done is so painfully obvious that it lacks the impact of figuring out some sort of secret build that you are able to uncover. When it comes to story progression, this is also just fine. Pacing is all over the fucking place, and certain plot points seem rushed through, while others, looking at you Dragula N section, is dragged on way too long. I think the progression of building up your fort and army is pretty good. Speaking of your fort, now is a good time to address all the other progression. There are so many random minigames that have their own little progression systems, but are just so meaningless in the grand scheme of things. Like, yes, I suppose you can get a good item for progressing through the rock climbing minigame, but I ask you, dear listener, is it really worth it? Is it? No. There is just so much stuff that you can, in theory, progress, like your battalions for the Fire Emblem-esque battles, but all of it lacks serious depth. It just begs the question, why the fuck is this in here? I'll tell you why. Stuff. The MO, modus operandum of Suikoden 2, is stuff. Whether that be a cooking minigame no one asked for, 100 and some odd companions, 80 of which no one fucking asked for, or a farm herding thing that no one needs nor wanted. But it's there. It's all just bloat. Even this could be forgiven if provided ample reason to overlook it, but there is just none. I guess technically the dice bowl thing leads to new companions, which leads to a unique ending, but the unique 103-star ending kind of sucks. Coming from a guy who followed the guide in order to get the true ending, I would have preferred I skip all that shit. This ending throws away any actual consequence of the war, any actual fallout from the self-destructive conflict between nations, and instead goes for the fucking kumbaya approach. It just felt so contrived. Now, granted, it was a secret ending, so take it with a grain of salt. Upon reading the other endings, they're not much better, but at least in one of the endings, you lose both your sister and Jowie, which might sound morbid, but at least this one feels like it applies some appropriate weight to this conflict between the two sides. The better question, above all else, why the hell am I talking about endings in the progression section? This kind of just goes to show how little there is to cover, so let's move on. Combat. Combat is pretty mid, overwhelmingly aided by the beauty of the animations. In battle, you can use a rune, do a regular attack, or use an item. That's quite literally it. I know if you break down many RPGs to their most fundamental core, that's all it is, but with most RPGs, there are multiple options within these categories. For example, most RPGs attack can mean regular attack or use an ability, maybe do a combo, maybe use a special attack that applies some status, but in Suikoden 2, I quite literally mean just attack. The only, and I do mean only, thing that could prevent this is if your character has a rune they use, and in just about every case, your rune has one specific choice you will just repeat. Whether it be offensive or defensive magic, you will just spam one of the two. Look at my final team, dog. Half the squad is just auto-attacking. The only companion that actually has maybe some strategy is Ryu, because he can pretty much do it all. But besides him, every companion has one action that they will do for the entire game. The only other morsel of strategy involved is positioning, but not really, because every companion is either explicitly a frontliner or backliner. But it is there, I suppose, and forces each character into a quote-unquote role and prevents the same type of unit filling every slot in your party. There's also another attack called Unite, which can be used if two specific companions are in your party that mesh with one another, and they can use this. But every Unite attack sucks ass and is not worth tanking your entire party composition for. Plus, the Unite combos are just baffling with who can team up with who, making the player wonder in what universe you would ever use both of those characters on a serious team. Ryu and Nanamise is cool and can be helpful, but of course it can, because they're the main characters. Outside of that, there is no actual reason to use it, because late game, giving up 2 turns for one weak attack is just a net loss. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, it requires the characters that can unite to give up their turn, which is just the cherry on top. Like all else in Suikoden, however, the Unite attacks look amazing and are worth pulling off once just to see the unique move, but after you've used it once, you probably will never use it again. That is outside of the main characters. The biggest saving grace for combat are the aspects I've mentioned before, the look and feel of fighting and enemy designs. It does genuinely feel good, besides being painstakingly one-dimensional. I never felt tired of combat due to these factors, but I also never loved combat due to the other factors I mentioned, if that makes sense. In terms of difficulty, it's I don't recall struggling on any boss besides Luca, but that's because he required a massive amount of companions that were properly leveled to fight him, which I did not have. This resulted in some bench warmers stepping up into the Luca meat grinder. Outside of this, there was no real difficulty at all, and this just further impeded the combat system. Like I said, bosses looked great and were fun to experience, but not all that fun to fight. One unique quality about the magic runes you use are that each tier of spell has limited uses per rest, so in theory there could be a sort of management aspect to dungeons and fights. But as I've said before, they're just too easy, which leads to you just saving your best spells and attacks for the boss of the area and just dropping nukes on it. This also causes some of the characters that are capable of doing more than auto-attacking to just do that. They end up auto-attacking because they have to save their cool things for the final boss. Like everything else though, when you release these runes, it does indeed look dope as all get out. So to wrap up, an unfathomably mid-combat system hoisted upon the shoulders of some of the best battle animations I have seen in an old-school JRPG, so them's the breaks. Now to cover companions. Normally I cover every companion and rank them in order of personal preference. There are 103 companions in this game, and I recruited every single damn one of them. No fucking shot of doing all that, especially considering I've forgotten just about every one of them. Actually, you know what? Let me try to name as many companions as I can think off the top of my head. We got Ryu, we got Jowy, kind of, Nanami, Victor, Flick, the blonde dude that's not Victor, the dog man, the dog's owner, Millicent, who I only remember because of her groundhog, the first edgy gun dude, the second like edgy gun dude that looks like the Hellsing anime character dude, that one mage I used, the dancer that thinks Ryu's hot. You get the point. That's all of them. That's all. They're just not very memorable. The thing about companions is that pretty much any NPC you interact with becomes a recruitable character, which seems really cool until you kind of realize the term lake wide, puddle deep has never been more applicable than with these characters. A vast majority only really get 1 or 2 scenes of development, if you can even call it that. I will now actually look back at my footage and choose a top 10 companions and talk about them, and I use the term top 10 loosely, so here we go. Upon looking at my top 10, I kind of just realized I picked any character that actually reoccurs within the plot, so this is more so a character rather than a companions list, but nonetheless, let's start. 10, we have Peshmerga. Why, you ask? Quite literally because he looks cool. Good start. Next, we have Khan, who is the vampire hunter who is trying to help us wrangle and defeat the Count from Sesame Street. Amid a pile of pure, unbridled doo-doo, Khan and his arc with the one vampire chick serve as a beacon of slightly more shiny and less stinky doo-doo, which makes it stand out in my mind, and that makes it good enough for 9. Next we have Ellie. No real reason besides that she's decent in combat, reappears multiple times in the story, and I like the traveling circus aspect about her. Now at 7 we have Chaco. I actually like the arc that revolves around Chaco and the bird people, but he is so fucking annoying that despite having okay-ish development, I still cannot stand him and his snotty ass design. I just want to put him in a headlock and stretch his underwear over his head. He deserves to be bullied is what I'm saying. At 6 we have Clive. Clive's whole side story is so confusing. For one, if you play the original Suikoden 2, no way you will actually ever experience it due to stringent time requirements. But in the remastered you can turn off this time, so it is actually completable without boogieing your way through the entire game. All of that to get interactions with someone? A bounty hunter thing? I don't even know. So why is he at 6, you ask? Because he actually has a story of some kind and he rips in combat. Next is Flick at 5. His name is actually Flick, I looked it up. Flick is fine. He kind of falls to the wayside despite being like the face of the mercenary army before your arrival, and his role gets replaced by Shu. I did like him for the first quarter of the game that he is actually present for, and the only reason he is this low is because of the second half, where his only purpose is to be hit on by some gooner student. Coming in at 4 is Nanami, your sister. I hate her. She is only up this far because she's a main character, but she is pretty insufferable. She provides pretty much all the anime-isms I despise and fakes her own death for legitimately no good reason at the end of the game. Good in combat and at least present for the entire game, so here we are. On the podium at number 3 is Jowy. Despite him only being a companion for a little bit, I actually quite like his character. I can say I did not expect the twist of him turning on us, but I chopped that up more so to it completely breaking his character and doing a switch up on the Jowy the game established towards the beginning. It made absolutely no sense, but fuck it, I'll roll with it. Also, this little freak stole my best early game rune when he left the party, so fuck him. But I actually like his role in the story. Being the conniving, scheming underling of Luca in order to bring him down just to fall victim to the same power lust in the name of peace is a brilliant approach to take with this character. This is why the whole Twilight Vampires subplot of the second half is disappointing, but I won't rehash that again. The time period that we are directly fighting with Jowy post-Luca is great, especially considering half the commanders we face are not bad people, rather people that genuinely believe in Jowy's vision of the future, and I loved it. Just wish we could have seen more of it. And I also wish I would have killed him in the final 1v1 duel, which would have been a better ending than I'm saying all's forgiving and fucking off with him and Nanami, but it is what it is. At number 2 is Victor. Victor is easily the best companion who, spoiler alert for the list, is not the main character. He's actually funny, provides a mature lens on the nature of war which contrasts with the innocence of Ryu, and canonically gets pussy, and his own subplot with the sword. Sign me up, brother. He's present throughout the entire story and gets multiple times to shine, and just as importantly is a physical beast in combat. I just loved everything about Victor, and if we had more companions given the love and care that he was, I would be singing a different tune regarding companions. And first is Ryu, the main character because, of course he's the main character. But I actually think he's a solid character in general, despite being the main character. Normally I roll my eyes at teenage characters like Nanami and Jowy, but in this case I think it works. It doesn't work with Jowy because of how Jowy acts once he betrays us, which is more in line with a 40-year-old political veteran like fucking Littlefinger in Game of Thrones, rather than a 16-year-old. And it doesn't work with Nanami because of how annoying she is due to her age. Ryu is a reserved but starry-eyed kid who has to deal with heaps of responsibility in a time when he yearns to return to being a true kid. This works really well, and the parts of the story where he's pretty much forced to grow up propels my interest in the plot. He maintains a sort of innocence while simultaneously not being some sort of pushover, and I think it's done really well with him. So yeah, that's my top 10, and that's the cream of the crop of these 103 characters, which kind of says something. So what is my conclusion on Suikoden 2? I've been absolutely ragging on this game throughout the breakdown, so is that truly how I feel? If you're a fan of stuff, then Suikoden 2 has got you covered. Every story beat you can imagine in a JRPG, more characters than you know what to do with, more animations and sprites than most games could dream of, and more mini-games than I have ever imagined necessary. If this sounds like your type of game, I can totally sympathize with that, and I could understand how you could love this game, but I am not that kind of person. I can't help but think about what even greater heights Suikoden 2 could have achieved if it cut down this roster to say 10 to 15 and put all the focus of other one-off characters and changed it to a few select. If it would have applied the same care and consistency of the artwork to the focus of the story and the plot, if it would have trimmed down on all the random pointless runes and instead created fewer with more impactful abilities that actually made the use of runes strategic rather than serving as an afterthought, man, I just shiver at what could have been. I can't help but feel that I just don't quite get the hype as to what is here. However, the presentation is an all-timer. I can wish and want to my heart's content, but if I look at what I'm given, at least it looks beautiful. Gorgeous character design, gorgeous combat, and gorgeous scenes. Suikoden 2 enjoys all of these in excess. This definitely bumps up Suikoden 2 in my eyes, and I think I have settled on a C-.
Number 18.
Final Fantasy Tactics. Final Fantasy Tactics is a tactical RPG developed and published by Square in 1997 for the PlayStation. Final Fantasy Tactics is a spin-off of the Final Fantasy universe and serves as probably the beacon of TRPGs, which is a spin-off of RPGs that focuses on grid-like maps and puts emphasis on the strategy of movement and action of each individual unit. The game was directed and written by Yasumi Matsuno, who we have actually seen in the past with Vagrant Story, and you can definitely tell. More on that later though. There are two main versions of this game, one being the original on the PlayStation and another being Final Fantasy Tactics War of the Lions, which was released for the PSP in 2007 and ported to iOS in 2011. The differences between the two are actually quite large. The main difference between the two is the gorgeous cutscenes that the PSP added, which is like this unique watercolor interpretation of some key scenes in the original. These cutscenes also include voice acting, which is very divisive to this day, but I don't really care. As far as gameplay differences, there are a couple. The biggest is the script, which got a whole new English translation that changes the original's blunt tone into a more Shakespearean old-timey English flair, which again is very divisive. Mechanically, 2 new classes were added with War of the Lions, a couple more recruitable characters who had tie-ins to Final Fantasy projects of the time, like Balthier from Final Fantasy XII and Luso from Final Fantasy Tactics Advance II, and a few balance changes like adding and removing some equipment and increasing the levels required for certain classes. Oh, yeah, and also the ratio of the screen was changed, as well as some of the sounds of spells, which is actually a big sticking point for many fans. As you can probably tell, these are pretty distinct and uniquely different versions of the same game, which led me to a crisis trying to determine which to play. Normally, I try to play the legal way, in that if there is a port or remaster available to buy on modern hardware, that's how I'll do it. In this case, there was not. Had I waited a couple months, Final Fantasy Tactics Chronicles of Ivalice would be announced and released for modern hardware, but that was not an option for me at the time. So I had to emulate, which is totally fine because I definitely have a PlayStation and a PSP as well as the original 2 games physically, of course. The question would be which? The community pretty much agrees that War of the Lions is the better version, but the purists online think the PlayStation is the way to go, so I was torn. I finally settled on War of the Lions purely because that seemed to be the overwhelming consensus. So keep in mind some issues I have may be more so with War of the Lions rather than Tactics itself, but I will make sure to mention it when this is the case. Oh, I forgot to mention, I also used the spell slowdown fix patch. In the original PSP version, whenever you used a spell, the frame rate would drop, and it caused spell animations to take way longer than the original PlayStation version. So this patch fixes that. Usually I'm against modding when playing games, as in most cases I don't like messing with the vision the creators originally had, but this was specifically a fault of the hardware rather than a direct choice, so I felt it was fine to use this. As far as previous playthroughs go, I have played Final Fantasy Tactics a little bit in the past, but not enough to even formulate an opinion, so I went in pretty unbiased. While playing it during that time, I came to the realization there was something I was not getting about it and determined I did not have the time to invest into understanding it. So I dropped it rather early, and that's all she wrote. Time to rectify that. With that massive intro out of the way, let's dive into the story of Final Fantasy Tactics. Before I tackle the story itself, it's lore time. The story is told through the lens of a future historian reading the account of his ancestor, detailing the actual events of what happened during the timeline of Final Fantasy Tactics. I'm just going to call it Tactics from now on, you can figure it out. This sounds confusing, but it's more so a tool to explain the narration of our story and to establish the fact that our main hero Ramza is a figure lost to history despite being a key figure in that said history. I think this is a really cool detail, highlighting how easily history can be changed and influenced by those in control of power, but again, it's not that important. During this account, we cover the events of what is known as the Lion War. This war is caused by the death of the ruler of the kingdom, which causes a sudden power vacuum, with two viable options for taking up the newly opened throne. On one side of the faction, we have the Black Lions, who are led by Prince Goltana, and side with Princess Ovelia, while on the other faction we have the White Lions, who are led by Queen Revulia and her brother Prince Larg, who has personal ties to our main character Ramza, which side with Prince Orynus. Now, this may seem like a bunch of fucking hubbubaloo, which it kind of is, but it is also the entire crux of the game and the catalyst of the war we soon find ourselves in, so I find it necessary to explain. It also gives a sneak peek into how in-depth and well thought out the politics of this entire fictional region are, and how many sides are undermining and fighting against one another behind the scenes. Most of the in-depth happenings of the nation are told through the rumors sections at each village you visit, which give a better view as to what's happening in the world. As far as we are concerned, the actual game starts off introducing us to Ramza, the main character of FF Tactics. Ramza is part of a mercenary group that's in charge of protecting Princess Ovelia, when all of a sudden she is kidnapped by a former friend and colleague of ours, known as Delita. The majority of Act 1 from here on out is pretty much a flashback, explaining the events as to how we got to this situation, and covering how a once proud noble of a powerful house, Ramza, ended up in the employment of a random mercenary band. From here, there is politicking aplenty and lots of twists and turns involving the church and the supernatural. Shit gets wild. Whew. So, where do I even start with this? I loved the story of Final Fantasy Tactics. As I get older and my ass cheeks get flabbier, I find I love a good political tale, and Final Fantasy Tactics provides that and then some. So many factions to keep track of and so many moving parts that it's genuinely hard to tell who to trust and who's on whose side at any given time. Not only for Ramza's point of view, but from ours as well, which helps put ourselves into Ramza's shoes as we try to wade our way through all the bullshit niceties to figure out who we can and can't trust. This cat and mouse game of finding out who genuinely has the best interests of our nation of Ivalice is brilliant. And like real life, there really is no perfect answer to this dilemma. I mean, sure, Delita at least seems to care for Ovelia, maybe kinda, but we firsthand see how absolutely ruthless he is in order to ensure power for himself. For every scene we see of him talking about how important it is to look over and protect Ovelia, we see just as many of him manipulating her and using her to his benefit. He may be the most scheming, back-ended character in the cast, and that's saying something, but he is still a likable person who you're kinda rooting for. His ending with the princess is tragic and such a brutal way to cap off this game, a true Shakespearean tale that kind of serves as the heart and soul of his story. This game also beautifully threads the needle between being silly and fantastical, yet still grounded. One key aspect of this story is how corrupt the church is and how they are using these magical stones to transform into demons to gain power. This could easily fly off the rails, but it's all treated with the appropriate seriousness and weight, which allows me to suspend my eye rolls in disbelief because of how invested in this universe I am. I also think Ramza might be my favorite main character in a Final Fantasy game, and possibly just in general. We see firsthand his transformation from a bright-eyed and bushy-tailed fledgling soldier into a hardened warrior, and he perfectly balances the sort of edge without being too edgy, because he is also intelligent and caring about those around him. I think a character like Cloud in Final Fantasy VII leans too heavily on the edge, and Tidus from Final Fantasy X leans too much on the upbeat and whimsical, but Ramza achieves that Goldilocks just right temperature. One of my favorite scenes is when a villain named Elmdor captures Ramza's sister and holds her hostage, demanding one of the demon stones in exchange for his sister. So many other games and pieces of media would have our character go, "Oh golly geez, gotta save my sister," and potentially doom the entire world for someone they care about, leading to the turning point in the story. Even though in those same stories they always pull through and save the day with some stupid Deus Ex Machina bullshit. But in Tactics, Ramza is more than some one-dimensional caricature and denies this request, knowing that this means he might have to sacrifice his sister if that ensures keeping the entire world safe. This just serves as a glimpse into the mature and fantastic writing of this game. Characters feel like actual people who behave in believable and logical ways. Ramza is not some stone-cold, uncaring person, but he's also not overly emotional and naive. He's just human, and I love this about him. Same goes for Delita, who despite being pretty ruthless and power-hungry, seems to want the best for the world, and we can empathize with how he started down this path due to the world of politics leading to the direct death of his sister. Another aspect I love about Final Fantasy Tactics is the lack of a villain. There's no big bad guy plotting the downfall of the universe. Sure, there are bad actors and evil characters who do awful things, but it's pretty much just a case of a bunch of bad apples desperately trying to cling on to any semblance of power and thus potentially dooming the world in this conquest. Crabs in the bucket, you know? It's a tale of how power corrupts, even those that start off with good intentions. Just about every quote-unquote bad guy we fight gets some redemption and displays at least some understanding and awareness of the wrongs they have committed in pursuit of their end goals. It just leads to a world that's easy to fall into because it feels real. It feels like it was written by people who want to tell a compelling, mature, and realistic story. The themes of class warfare and struggle are also really well handled, without ever coming off as preachy, but reinforcing heavier themes such as this consistently through the inclusion of many different characters from many different economic backgrounds, altering their outlook on life. I could gush about this plot all day, and sure, I could also nitpick minor grievances I have with certain scenes, but I would just rather wrap it up here and conclude that this story is a masterpiece you must experience. Now on to the presentation. This one's a bit tricky. When I first played this game, way back in college, I thought the look of it was awful. Sure, the cutscenes were sick, but just the sprites and chibi-like characters kind of threw me off, so I completely understand people that despise the look of this game. However, for whatever reason, this time it just worked for me. I still don't think it entirely fits the tone of the game, but in some ways that kind of enhances it. It's a double-edged sword because, based on the look of it, you could not be blamed for assuming this is a more childlike game in nature, but you couldn't be further from the truth. The story is mature and there are some pretty violent scenes in this game. But that first look at it does give off a bad first impression. Once you're in for the ride, you start to get so lost in the story that the initial shock of conflicting visuals with tone gets lost. And the further into Tactics you get, the better it looks. Some of these demons you encounter and fight are straight up horrific. And the few scenes of violence are enhanced because it's told through a lens which you would not expect violence to show up in. On top of that, the Final Fantasy flares add such personality to this world. Every class's sprites are all-timers. They all look so cool and so iconic, and having some of the classic Final Fantasy sprites like the Black Mage in a Tactics game is such a spark of brilliance. Some of my favorite Final Fantasy class designs are actually in Tactics. like the Samurai and Time Mage. Plus, all classes are distinct enough from one another that you can recognize an enemy's class just based off of their design. There's no room for confusion. Enemy monster designs are also equally great, with so many memorable fights against random enemies, whether they be dragons or goblins or even wild chocobos. Every design is packed to the brim with personality, and the entire game just oozes style. It does all of this while juggling memorability with rather simple designs, and this is the magic of Final Fantasy, the brilliance in simplicity. This also allows for the bosses we fight against to shine, as some of these fuckers are terrifying due to their ogreish and just hell-like look. Sure, they can be a little over-designed, but it just works because it makes them stand out even more. Bell animations also look so amazing to pull off. Sure, in the PSP version, some of the original sound design may get lost due to compression, but those visuals still stand the tests of time. I think the music is great as well. At first, I kind of felt like the soundtrack was overhyped. Nothing really stood out to me or stuck with me. However, like so many other things in this game, the longer I experienced it, the more sucked in I became. There's this air of mystery present throughout the soundtrack, and the heavier, more bombastic themes serve as the perfect counter to the more introspective, calm tracks backing narrative scenes. Sure, it lacks a singular, memorable track that I catch myself humming around the house, but listening back, the music transports me to the scenes they are from and makes me nostalgic for this game despite only having played it a couple of months ago. I understand why it gets lost in the rubble due to the franchise it comes from, but this is seriously an underrated soundtrack that I enjoyed tremendously. My only real complaint with the presentation is that I think the menus can get quite confusing to wrap your head around, and that's coming from someone who sat his ass through that dogshit menu tutorial. Menus can also be designed in a way where it's hard to tell elevation differences at some angles. You just entirely lose the character you're controlling, or accidentally move them to the wrong spot. On that note though, just the fact you can rotate the camera is amazing. I know that sounds like sarcasm, but trust me, it's not. We will cover a game that does not have this luxury, and boy howdy did I miss it. All in all, I enjoyed the presentation of Tactics, but I can also see how someone could completely not fuck with it. I, for one, am a fan though. Now on to progression. Remember the story section where I gargled the nuts of how good Final Fantasy Tactics story is? Well, I hope the progression dick is just as dry, because I'm about to get to slurping. My god. Favorite progression so far, bar none. How do I even begin to explain the system? It is based off of a job system. This is the idea that you pick a class to play as, and as you play this class and use abilities, you gain JP, job points, which can be used to unlock new abilities which become permanently attached to that job, and allows you to pick other attributes from that same class to carry over to other classes. JP can only be earned and used for the job currently equipped, which means you have to have a job equipped to progress it. I know this is confusing, so I'll give an example. The most important ability one can learn is Auto Potion from the Chemist class, which is a reaction ability that allows the character to automatically drink a potion if hit. It's super OP, and if you gain enough JP, you can unlock it and use it as a reaction ability regardless of whether or not you are currently using the Chemist class, because you can equip only this ability on a different class. On the other hand, maybe you're playing Monk and you want to try out a new ability, so you use your JP to unlock Shockwave, which is a ranged attack that is now permanently attached to the Monk specific class. So you either have to play as Monk to use this, or you have to carry all of the Monk's action abilities to another class. Within a class, you're allowed 2 action abilities. One is always the action abilities of the class you have equipped, and the other is up to you. Dealer's choice. So you could have a Chemist with Monk action abilities, but that's it. However, you have other abilities that aren't necessarily actions, like movement, support, and reactions, which can come from any class. Sounds confusing, but it's super fun to engage with and build your character because it becomes a game of theory crafting. Let me give you one final example to tie it all together. By leveling up with the ninja job equipped, you can unlock all of their action abilities, but you can also equip and use thief actions in order to steal. You can then equip the chemist's reaction ability, Auto Potion, the squire's JP boost support ability, which boosts JP acquisition, and finally the time mage's teleport movement ability, all on the same ninja character. So one character utilizing 4 other classes on their main class ninja, all of which had to be played and unlocked in order to equip these abilities. This leads to the obvious journey of how do I get this cool ability into this type of class, or how do I make this certain class I'm enjoying even better, and the possibilities are endless. I found myself at my actual job just staring off into space, wondering what would be the most optimal route to unlock a certain class that I could then carry over to a different class with better equipment. Also, some jobs can only be unlocked after gaining a certain amount of levels from another job or another couple of jobs. The best way of thinking about this system is as a flowchart, where your job is to figure out what you want a given character to be with what abilities, and what will be the most optimal route to get there. But a big part of the fun is just experimenting with different classes and figuring out which parts from which can work in tandem with one another, and which ones you enjoy the most. It just leads to the most rewarding character building system I have ever played. Also, this method of acquiring new skills and abilities by playing as the respective classes leads to you getting a full feel of the system, because you find yourself playing as classes you would normally never touch to see if there's something worth snagging. A true masterclass when it comes to the act of building out units, and there is so much fun to be had here, whether your goal is to create a nuke of a unit or just to have fun and experiment. Let us now talk about other forms of progression. I think the level curve is so fucking wonky. The beginning stages are generally tough. You have less classes to utilize and less abilities mastered, so the first half of the game before your units really open up can be quite brutal. At these stages, the more powerful, higher up jobs actually inversely tend to be the weakest because they have the least amount of abilities and levels available by the time you unlock them. So you're stuck with this choice of either sticking with jobs you have already mastered and gotten all the goodies out of, which leads to wasted experience, or you switch classes to make use of experience but get cumstered by enemies. This leads to one of two routes: brute force your way through encounters or grind up these levels. Final Fantasy Tactics must have pulled some fucking judo Jedi mind trick on me, because normally I hate grinding, but here I would find myself volunteering to grind because I so desperately wanted to unlock the full potential of my units. However, even grinding has two parts. There's the actual grind of fighting enemies to level up, but more importantly is grinding JP within these encounters. So, quite literally, grinding while grinding. I can see why this part of the game is a big detriment to a lot of people, but as I've said, I was so bought into the character building that this didn't even feel like a chore to me, but I totally understand people that do feel this way. Back to the level curve though. After this beginning, the midpoint climaxes with the boss that is quite literally famous for forcing players to restart their entire games. Let me explain. Before this boss, you were prompted to save. I've always used every save slot that a game has given you, but this is largely due to my Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess 100 plus hour save being nuked by my sister out of spite when I was younger, thus forming a safety measure that has stood the test of time. So I completely understand that, like my former self, there are lots of people out there who only use one save slot, and if you use that one save slot before this boss and are unable to beat him, you're cooked. Quite literally, you are hardlocked. Even worse, it's not even just a skill issue. For this boss, you can only use Ramza, which you are given no warning of until after the save, and if you have built him to be a physical tank, then it's no big deal. But if he is some sort of, say, mage with low physical defense, it is just quite literally impossible to beat him, especially if the job you currently have equipped is low leveled. This also occurs with no warning as to what is about to happen, so many runs could be destroyed by this brutal boss. If you can squeak by him though, the rest of the game becomes such a cakewalk due to being gifted a thunder god himself. Overall, I really like the more strenuous and difficult opening sections of Final Fantasy Tactics, but I also equally enjoyed finally reaching the endgame character builds that I had built up for the entire game. I didn't care that I decimated all the endgame bosses because it felt like I was being rewarded for putting the work in, except for the gifting of broken companions, but I'll cover that in the companion section. As far as story progression goes, it's great. It is a bit of a weird start, dropping you into this intense world and conflict and then going back in time to show the events leading up, but once you jump this hurdle, its pacing is great, and I never felt like it rushed plot elements or dragged in key locations. So yeah, that's about this entire sum of it when it comes to progression. And in case you hadn't noticed, I fucking adored it. Now for the combat. Combat is pretty great, but it is really important to know that combat greatly relies on the job system. If you have shitty little builds on shitty little characters, combat is gonna suck. But regardless, outside of the jobs, the core combat system here is really fun. It perfectly nails the strategy aspect to a turn-based system by having a smaller scale of battles. In some strategy games, you have a gazillion units, so having one or two go down in a fight is not the end of the world. In FF Tactics, one wrong move or a critical hit at the wrong time can completely turn the tides of battle, especially considering that just the act of using items is locked behind a class ability. This means you can't just heal whenever is necessary or revive units as soon as they go down. If you want to do this, you have to have a dedicated unit capable of healing, so every tick of damage is important in the long run. Now, there are many classes that have their own source of healing and some reviving, but the point stands, you can't just brute force your way with healing items. That is until every member has auto potion equipped. Position is key here. During combat, you choose where you want your units to move and what actions you want them to perform, but these actions are based on the job and abilities you have equipped, so no two units will be the same, unless you choose to make them so. This leads to combat feeling fresh, and each character feeling distinct from one another. There are other behind-the-scenes calculations that affect damage, like Zodiac Sign capability and Faith versus Power stats, but we'll ignore this as they simply serve as buffs to certain actions and never dictated my course of actions within combat. Map layout does play a key role in combat, as there are aspects like elevation and direction that add an extra element of strategy to fights, because jobs/characters have a given jump stat that determines how high up that character can move or attack. For example, on the isometric plane, you may be next to a character within attacking range, but if they are high up enough, you can attack them. This leads to jobs like the Dragoon becoming invaluable because they pretty much have no restrictions on how high they can move. Late into the game, if upgraded enough, Dragoons can use their ability Jump to quite literally hit any unit on the map at any location. It's straight nasty. But the beauty in Final Fantasy Tactics is that this is an ability which can be learned and put onto any other unit, just like any other aspect. Back to combat basics though. There is height, and also positioning. After your turn has concluded, you choose the direction you want your character to face. This is important because hits from the front can be slightly protected, hits from the side do neutral damage, and hits from behind do increased damage, so it is imperative to make sure you're never caught from behind with your pants down. I also think the enemies are pretty great in how Final Fantasy Tactics approaches them. Obviously, monsters are typical monsters with their own unique attacks and spells, but the interesting fights are against other humans who have their own jobs and abilities equipped. This leads to interesting gameplay, because based on the sprite, you can obviously tell what one of their class abilities is, but remember, there are two that can be equipped, and that's just for the action abilities. Oftentimes in this game, I would approach what I thought was a regular old mage with a physical attacker of my own, just to find out they had some monk skill equipped and dealt solid damage to my character from close range. This uneasiness and inability to immediately tell the full suite of abilities from enemies is genius, and better yet, it tests your knowledge of the job system to bait out certain moves and to try to get an idea of what build they might be using in order to best them. Battles also wrap up relatively quick, which is always nice in a TRPG, where in many games fights can last 30 to 40 minutes, but here they're usually only about 10 to 15 minutes. Unless you're grinding within one, then they can obviously take longer. My only semi-complaint is how luck-dependent some of these fights can be. Margins of error can be tiny, and some of the behind the scenes I mentioned, like the Zodiac Signs, are randomized for every battle. So in some battles you will deal more damage against certain enemies, and in other battles you will deal less. Positioning before fights also feels useless. You can't see the map before choosing positioning, so it feels like just randomly placing your units in a generic conformation without any real strategy being applied. I think other TRPGs like Tactics Ogre do this much better by allowing you to strategize by seeing the field you're about to enter. Sure, this may be a part of the intended difficulty, as it is not uncommon to be ambushed by enemies behind you, but this feels more cheap than an actual fair difficulty change. Considering these are my only gripes, that should speak volumes as to the praise I'm giving Final Fantasy Tactics. Great combat system that only suffers from being a bit grind heavy and RNG dependent, but shines when combined with its brilliant job progression system. Now let's talk about companions. Ironically enough, I think the companions are the weakest part of Final Fantasy Tactics. When I replay this game in the future, I will most definitely not use the companions you receive. The main reason is because at the beginning of the game, you're given a squad of recruits to flesh out and build up, utilizing the job system throughout the entire game and creating these units who have been perfectly shaped and melded by you. Then a large swath of companions who you don't have any real attachment to, save for a few, come through and dog walk your team members and replace them. No matter how cracked of an archer you've created, Balthier is just better. Don't even get me started on the fucking big chungus Mr. Bombastique himself, the Count Sodolphus Orlando. I am glad I used them because I got to experience these unique classes, but I felt super bummed I felt the need to drop my other crewmates who were just on the precipice of their power spike. Again, I could have chosen to bench these new companions, but I wanted the full experience so I used them, which I now kind of regret. But it is what it is. Future playthroughs this will not happen though, and as much as I'm bitching, I still was able to morph and create unique builds with these new companions. I just felt less of a connection to them than my OG squad, despite them being actual named companions with backgrounds. But enough lip flapping. You know how it be. Ranking all companions in order of enjoyment from last to first. Let's get it. In last place, we have the Chocobos and assorted dragons. I don't even know if these technically count, but they are recruitable units you can place on your team, so I guess? They aren't bad by any means. Some of the abilities they have are fun to use, and I really like the idea of some of the characters using Chocobos as mounts in battle. The problem is the opportunity cost. In no universe is it ever worth it to drop a dedicated unit for a Chocobo or a monster unless you're just a big fan of using these things. They also have a breeding mechanic, which is neat, but again, why breed them at all when even at their best, most perfected form pales in comparison to a halfway decently built human combat unit? In the same vein, next we have Byblos, who is better due to being unique and a cool monster companion in concept, but again, it's just too weak in comparison. Plus you get this thing right at the very end when you have definitely finished building and optimizing your team. Right next to him is Construct 8, who is the most viable of the non-human companions slash monsters slash chocobos slash dragons. His ranged attack is nasty, and he does some pretty impressive damage, but again, I feel like a broken record here, just he does not stack up against the other units, story-wise or combat-wise. Now we can finally cover the human companions that can actually utilize the best part of Final Fantasy Tactics, the job system. In last place, reverse drumroll please, we have Luso. This was part of a tie-in to the upcoming new Final Fantasy Tactics game when War of the Lions came out. He isn't bad, he just doesn't fit. He sticks out like a sore thumb and his skills don't do enough to differentiate himself from other much better characters. He is a game hunter who hunts monsters really well. Cool, don't give a fuck about monsters in this game, so pass. Next is Cloud, who's very obviously an homage to Final Fantasy VII. Again, you get him way too late, and on top of that, he sucks ass. At least it looks cool though. Next is Reyes. I think that's how you say her name. This one is tough, as she actually has a story, and a story that's tied to the game. The problem is she is just mid, and her role in said story is the damsel to be rescued. She can transform into a dragon, which is sick in theory, but as I've said, dragons are kinda meh compared to kitted out units, so it's underwhelming. And you get her so late that she falls here. Next is a three-way tie because I don't even remember these companions. That would be Rafa, Marok, and Meliadul. Rafa and Merrick are fine in theory, but their mage classes are odd, and you can't even pick what specific tile they hit, but rather what set of tiles, and it's up to RNG whether it actually hits your opponent or not. Any regular mage class that you have built up on your own is probably going to be 10 times more efficient than them, which kind of leads them lacking. Meliadul is amazing, but you get her at the literal end of the game, so it's kind of pointless. Cracking the top 5, we have Beowulf. He's the other half of the Reyes quest, but you get him earlier into the quest line, and on top of that, he's the one initiating the quest and working with you to rescue Reyes. On top of that, he is probably the best buffer in all of the game, and he is no offensive slouch, so he acts as the party cleric, which slides into just about any party composition. He is only at 5 because of how late you get him. If you got him at an earlier time, he would be much higher up. Next is Balthier. If we are talking raw power output, he would probably be at number 2, but he, like Luso, is an addition through the War of the Lions edition, meant to be a tie-in to Final Fantasy XII. And while he is crazy good, there's just no story to him outside of his recruitment mission. He feels like an odd side character, and even though he is really strong and fun to use, he just feels off due to his inclusion. Number 3 is Mustadio. You get him really early, he can use guns, sick, and you can build him to work really well. So why 3? Because of Balthier. Admittedly, this is a War of the Lions problem, not a tactics problem. If this was regular Final Fantasy Tactics, Mustadio would deserve top 3. But in War of the Lions, Balthier just comsters the poor fella. But he is higher because he actually has a character within the plot, and we see him get fleshed out as the story goes. I find this to make him a better character despite getting dropped in my party for Balthier as soon as we got him. And number 2 is Agrias. I really do love her character, and her growth as a character. Seeing her slide out of this archetypical bodyguard role and slowly get hit with the reality of having to juggle responsibility to one's morality, their country, and their own personal ties is great. We see Agrias struggle with these topics so well without feeling like it's pulling away from the plot, or in such a drastic manner that it feels unrealistic. It is handled really fantastically, and her character becomes cemented in the wider Final Fantasy roster. Combat-wise, her class is great, and easily buildable, so I didn't even feel like I had any specific direction I had to take her. She works really well inside of combat and out, and she would easily be my favorite if not for one of the others. This one feels like cheating. Cid. What do you want me to say? His character is so sick, and he's pretty much the most recognizable character in Final Fantasy Tactics absent Ramza. What's even crazier is the infamy as to why he is so recognizable. This character is an actual nuke. You're handed a nuke halfway through the game that just waltzes you through the second half. He is disgustingly broken when it comes to power levels, and by the time I felt like I had finally made a character that surpassed how strong he was, the game was over. So for 90% of the second half of this game, every fight feels like an auto win because of how strong Cid is. On top of all that, he also has a pretty integral role within the plot. Character-wise, I would probably prefer Agrias, but as a whole package, the Thunder God himself, Count Sidolphus Orlando, is undeniable, and easily the best companion in Final Fantasy Tactics. Editor's note, if I included Ramza in this section, he would be number 1, but I already talked about him in the story section, so skipping over him. And that's a wrap on Final Fantasy Tactics. Wow. What an unexpected haymaker from a game I had an indifferent attitude towards pre-playthrough. When you're a spin-off from a franchise in general, it's hard to live up to the name of the franchise you're spinning off of, which in most cases is why it's a spin-off. Sure, there may be other reasons, such as making a game in a new style that is outside the purview of the original series, but that's not always the case. There are plenty of spin-offs that are just meh. Final Fantasy Tactics is not only worthy of the franchise it was spawned from, but it is a worthy metric to hold mainline Final Fantasy games to. A fantastic story combined with one of the best progression systems I have ever experienced leads to an instant recommendation and high esteem from this old bag of bones. I'm going to give Final Fantasy Tactics an S-. Truly a must-play for Final Fantasy dweebs and RPG dorks alike.
Bilang 11.
Earthbound. Also known as Mother 2 in Japan, but there's America, baby. One of the most infamous JRPGs of all time. Earthbound was developed by Ape Inc. and HAL Laboratory and was published by Nintendo for the Super Nintendo in the beautiful year of our Lord, 1994. Earthbound is technically the second installation in the Mother game series and was supposed to serve as the West's big introduction to this funky-ass franchise. It was released to straight dog-ass sales in the US, cursing the Mother IP to be banished back to the Shadow Realm, Japan. This would have rippling effects, resulting in the sequel, Mother 3, still yet to be released properly in the US, which is just fucking mind-blowing. In the modern era, Earthbound has seen quite the resurgence in the West, largely due to word of mouth and this little indie game you might know called Super Smash Bros., which featured our little guy Ness. This leads directly into my experience with Earthbound, which, like many other rascals in the US, would have no fucking clue what a NES or a Mr. Saturn is, absent of Super Smash Bros. I remember I went through a phase where I wanted to play through the game of every character present on the Super Smash Bros. Brawl roster, which eventually led me to Earthbound. I hopped onto my Samsung Gravity Q, downloaded an emulator which probably brought a nice little bit of malware with it, and played through Earthbound. So yes, this is one of the few games I actually have played fully, previous to this go-around. I think there's something to be said about why Earthbound stuck with me in my younger days. At this time, I was not a big RPG fan, and I mainly played whatever random ROM I could find on pirate sites. But there was just something so undeniably entrancing with this game, something so unique that I found myself getting lost in this world and playing it every chance I had. But we're not talking about then. We're talking about now. The only legal ways to play this bad boy outside of just directly owning a cartridge in Super Nintendo is to play it through the totally intuitive method of paying for a subscription to Nintendo Switch Online and playing it through this app on the Nintendo Switch. I guess technically there is a Super Nintendo Classic and a Wii U/3DS Virtual Console, but let's stop kidding ourselves. You're either emulating this or playing it on the Switch. Why does it have no official release? Quite literally no fucking clue. I'm not a conspiracy fella, but I genuinely think Nintendo of America hates the Mother franchise. As far as how it ran, it was fine. It's a 30-year-old fucking game. Like, what do you want me to say? A surprising amount of slowdown if multiple enemies are on screen, but it just kind of sounds like that's more so an issue with the game itself than Nintendo Switch Online, so it is what it is. Since I did play it this way, please excuse the sidebars and the giant Mario Easter Island head in the top left, which is my icon. Okay, enough pretense. Let's jump into this r/indie ass game. Earthbound takes place in a modern Americana setting known as Eagle Land, where our main protagonist, Ness, is awakened in the middle of the night by the crashing of a meteor outside of his house. He investigates this occurrence with his neighbor Pokey, who is looking for his younger brother, Picky. Once they arrive at the meteor crash site, we meet a small fly creature thing from the future known as Buzz Buzz. I know this sounds like schizobabble, and that's because it is. Side tangent, I once tried to explain the entire plot to my girlfriend when she walked in and saw me playing it, only to realize I was probably 1 or 2 bad sentences away from being admitted into a ward. Back to the story though. So Big Dog Buzz Buzz explains to us that a grave threat known as Gigas threatens existence as we know it, and the only way to prevent the destruction of Earth is to gather melodies from 8 sanctuaries where they can be used to fight Gigas, and yep, they're knocking on my door. From here, Buzz Buzz is killed by Pokey's fucking bitch mom, and you set out on your own to gather friends and melodies alike, and put a stop to this threat. So how do I feel about this story? It truly is tough to say. Obviously, the point of the plot is to be as off the walls as possible. It truly feels like an acid trip to experience this story from start to finish. So many curveballs get thrown at you in terms of experimentation, and I felt like every time I had seen it all in Earthbound, there came a new batshit plot point. It manages to do all of this while maintaining a jovial tone, which does not sacrifice its goofs and gaffes for more somber, serious moments. It really is remarkable. It is just as important to the overall Earthbound experience as the insane presentation, which I will get to. It does occasionally fall into this awkward zone of being completely divorced from any semblance or sense of reality, which can serve as a negative and a positive. I definitely felt like I was just along for the ride to see where the fuck we were going, but I did miss a more grounded sense, which could have caused the serious tones and themes to hit a little bit harder. I do want to emphasize that I'm not saying there are no instances of genuine emotional beats in this game that stuck with me. It just feels like they are a little too segregated to the end. The ending bits like Ness's subconscious realm or the entire Gigas motif are much more impactful in a serious way rather than a sillier one when compared to the rest of the game, and these are some of my favorite parts of Earthbound. I would have appreciated a couple more moments like this sprinkled throughout the entirety, but I do want to say all the surreal, lighthearted insanity was also just as enjoyable, just in a slightly different way. That's why I feel torn. Small details like the fact Ness can get a status known as homesickness is a brilliant way to hit home on the more serious and emotional themes. The only way to get rid of homesickness is to call your mom, which is just such a simple gameplay-focused inclusion that does so much with so little. It reinforces the fact that Ness is a child going on this scary journey, and getting that status and realizing what has been messing with Ness in combat hits hard. It also does this without having to have a dedicated scene to point this out. Simple, quick, effective, and straight to the point. This is great. On the other hand, one of my favorite sequences is when you're transported to Moonside and this entire section is anarchical gibberish. There's no rhyme or reason to anything occurring, and I felt way more along for the ride rather than tethered to some emotional backbone. Yet this is another one of my favorite sections in the game because of how much Earthbound pushes the envelope when it comes to its story. This is what I mean when I say it's tough to say, because it does do both well. I just think overall it may lean a little too heavily into the goober territory. On a different note, I also think this game handles meta humor really well. I never felt like the fourth wall breaks or broader commentaries on the RPG space got in the way of this game and its story, just because of how well Earthbound does its juggling act. One of the dungeons you go through is literally a workshop for the game designer, which explains the concepts of dungeon design the entire time you're fighting through it, and it just works. It didn't feel like it detracted from the experience one bit, and if anything, increased the enjoyment I got out of this dungeon. Let's now get into the villains a little bit. I think both of the villains in this game kind of suffer from 2 of 3 syndrome. What I mean is Gigas gets far more development in the original Mother, which I haven't played, and Pokey's entire villain arc culminates in Mother 3, which I also have not played. So on the one hand, I get the development of a villain I've yet to fully experience, and on the other hand, I get the climax to a villain I didn't have any build up to. For what I am given though, I think they both work really well. Pokey is a perfect villain for the silly plot points, and Gigas serves as a phenomenal finish to the serious aspect of the plot, which may result in the best final boss fight I've encountered so far. The tone and eeriness of this fight is unmatched. I have played horror games which can't touch the creepiness and dread that is entailed in this final fight. The off-putting remarks from this degradation of a being known as Gigas is unnerving, and even the music which morphs from this upbeat 8-bit backing to this amalgamation of noise puts the heebie-jeebie factor to 10. I really cannot overstate how good this fight is, and it matches the idea of Gigas not being a singular figure bent to destroy the world, but rather this force to be reckoned with. Something outside the bounds of understanding that you have to fight. It's great, and dare I say, Lovecraftian, which sounds bonkers to use in description of an Earthbound villain, but it's true. Final point I want to end on, because I've already talked about the story way more than I planned to, but I just love the boldness of this game. The absolute balls to actually include this psychedelic acid trip illusion is incredible. No, not in the hee Mario eats the shrooms and starts seeing epic turtles and pretends small fat plump Italian children are Goombas he has to jump on. No, not like Reddit tier interpretations of psychedelia in video games. I mean like you quite literally eat chocolate cake, which distorts the game's visuals and soundtrack. It's pretty on the nose, and even more outright stated in Mother 3, where the group eats literal mushrooms to the same effect, so I know I'm correct here. This despite of any vague plausible deniability there might be because it was originally an E-rated game. Finally, the fact that you only ever interact with your dad on the phone, it's just such a unique and, for lack of a thesaurus, bold decision to make. The game never says your mother and father are divorced, nor is it outright ever implied since your father only has nice things to say about your mother. It's just one of these looming aspects of the game that feels like such a matter-of-fact lens to view something like this through. Is he an overworked father who's never home? Maybe. Is he divorced from your mom? Don't know. All that matters is he is a physically absent father throughout the game, and this part just always intrigued me with its inclusion, and I can't help but think how important this could be to a kid who might have a mirror image to this exact reality, and I love it when Earthbound includes things like this. Now for the presentation. Boy oh boy, if you thought I yapped about the story, the Yapfest Express has just arrived, baby. Call me a quirky little chungus, but I love the vibe of this game. Let's start off with the setting. This is probably one of my favorite settings in an RPG. Just the concept of setting an RPG in the modern era is something you hardly ever see, so it already stands out in that regard. On top of that, this idealized 60s era America is a vibe I just love. The psychedelia of the entire experience of Earthbound also directly plays into this time period with things like Woodstock, the Beatles, and the Summer of Love occurring in the real world. It just fits into the presentation Earthbound is going for, so this specific era is the perfect setting for a psychedelic romp through the world like this. We see this further reflected through the music, which directly samples the Beatles and the Beach Boys, and it all just meshes so well together. Let's talk about the graphics, all 16 bits of them. I think above all else, the most important aspect to the visual presentation of Earthbound is the color palette. The game is so bright and contains so many pastels that every single scene just jumps out of the screen. It's impossible to deny the eye-popping aspect of Earthbound. It's so visually jarring in the best possible way. So many beautiful blues, reds, yellows, purples, masterfully balanced to create the most captivating compositions you can see in this era of SNES graphics. Sure, you have your chrono triggers and secretive manas, but what animations Earthbound may lack, it makes up for in spades when it comes to the look and feel. Some of my favorite RPG towns and cities are here in Earthbound. Onett, despite being the very first town you arrive to, feels so homey and American and sets the perfect stage for the areas to come. Forsen is just incredible, perfectly capturing the overwhelming feeling of a big metropolis city like New York City. I actually visited New York City last year, and the feel of that city is perfectly captured with Forsen, with the skyscrapers angled in a way that tricks the viewer's mind into thinking there are these looming buildings to dwarf Ness and company. The beach feel of Somerton and the touristy aspects reflect many cities in America like this, whose entire economy is based around tourism. I live close to a couple of these where I'm from. Overall, these cities breathe such life into every stop Ness makes in his journey and allows you to get lost in Eagle Land. Now, let's tackle the auditory part of the presentation. Alexa, play some of that funky music for a white boy. Prior to this playthrough, I think I would consider Final Fantasy VI as my favorite soundtrack of all time. Nah, son. Earthbound has taken that crown. Earthbound contains track after track, some of the best themes and songs I have ever heard. The simplicity of the melodies and beat structures somehow enhances the overall songs themselves. I think of some of my favorite tracks like Paula's theme, which jumps between a simple, eerie lead to a muted yet upbeat, hopeful second half. It is phenomenal. It also has this confident, otherworldly aspect to it that adds so much more weight to every scene that utilizes it. And how about that boss theme? It has the perfect build-up with such a rhythm and lead that takes advantage of the ominous synth build-up to arrive at this alien. It feels strange and uncertain, yet so goddamn funky at the same time. I'm fucking swaying right now just imagining that little electronic drum beat in the background. Don't just take my word for it. The internet agrees with me as damn near 30 years later, this theme reared its head in the memosphere, whatever you want to call it. Some of the most heart-wrenching moments in this game come off the back of this insanely good soundtrack. The calm serenity of the Soundstone locations, the big city feel of Fourside, which utilizes the main melody of Frank Sinatra's My Way, and the tension release of the song that plays after Gigas' defeat. I could literally make the rest of this video about me listing moments that stick in my head because of the songs in the background, but I think you get the gist. Let's now transition into the enemy designs. Some of the enemies you fight in this game are cops, hippies, and cultists. I know what you might be thinking. You playing fucking Fallout? No, I'm playing Earthbound. But this just proves my point of how well this game juggles a more mature feel of the game, with this childlike and innocent lens through the use of all the bright colors or young protagonists. Sure, you have your infamously famous, true. Spittin'. Sure, you have your infamously goofy enemies like piles of vomit or an actual circus tent, but this game has so many enemies that you will quite literally never find in a single other game. I mean, just look at this shit on screen. What the fuck? This allows me to zoom out to a broader scope of just how well it works together. The point of the presentation section is to not individually scope out single factors of what works and what doesn't. I mean, sure, I do that, but that's not the main point. The main point is how it all comes together. The bright colors wouldn't be as popping without the character sprites and designs, which would not be fully utilized without a setting that they can snugly fit into, which cannot be set properly without a soundtrack that immerses you into that location. It all works together in such an indescribable way. If I plucked out single points one by one and then presented them to you as a final product, you would think I'm crazy. An RPG, which has forever been associated with medieval settings, set in America, despite being made by Japanese developers, drowned in 60s era psychedelic tendencies, with your main cast being made of children who fight robots from the future in a plot that utilizes meta-irony to its fullest extent, with a backing soundtrack of some of the strangest themes you've ever heard. A premise like this could have so easily fallen down the negative connotation of capital Q quirky to an end result that makes me roll my eyes to the back of my fucking skull, but somehow this entire combination becomes the best part of Earthbound. Let's jump on to progression. This is where my endless heaps of praise start to dwindle, unfortunately. Let's sneak one more compliment in while we're still in it though. The pacing of Earthbound is great. Story beats never overstay their welcome, plot points move at the speed of light, and never once did I feel sick of a setting or particular region of this game. That is undeniable. Story progression is top notch. Every other progression? Well, less notch, we'll say. I'm not saying anything is bad per se, but it just feels so glaringly average in comparison to the other legendary facets of this game. Let's start off easy with the character progression. From a story perspective, you get one little tiddly bit about each character you recruit before you recruit them, and that's it. The characters you see before you get them is the character you see at the end of the game. There's no real growth outside of Ness, which is a shame. Understand Ness's journey of having to grapple with the fact of him being a child in an increasingly terrifying and dangerous world, and how his inner psyche is affected by this, i.e. his subconscious at the end. But that's about it. It's a good coming-of-age story, but there's no real characters outside of Ness that quote-unquote come to age. That's also more of a gripe when it comes to companions in the writing, but we'll get to that. As for character progression in terms of leveling up, it's fine. Every level you gain increases your stats, and Pooh, Ness, and Paula occasionally get a new named PSI power as they level, but that's the gist. Fucking mumbled and bumbled and stumbled my way through that. Again, this plays into the problem of this not being a bad system, just aggressively bland. Sure, the animations each of these PSI upgrades get are great, but that's presentation. In practice, they all do relatively the same thing, and the only really interesting characteristic in terms of PSI is the management of your SP, but that's not necessarily exclusive to Earthbound. Its gameplay and progression systems are very reminiscent of early JRPGs in particular, which makes sense because it is one, but outside of that, it doesn't bring anything else interesting into the fray. With other games, you have choices with how to level a character, or you have a plethora of characters to choose from. You have neither in Earthbound, which could be acceptable if the combat system made up for this, and quite frankly, it just doesn't, but I don't want to jump the gun. The overall difficulty curve actually feels great. I never felt the need to grind, nor did I ever feel severely underpowered or overpowered. I always felt the appropriate level for the situation I was given, which is a huge plus for this game. In terms of gear progression, there are no real choices you have to make, as every new piece of gear you get is a pure upgrade, but the gear itself is fun. Again, harkening back to the presentation, the weapons you get are entirely unique, with different types of bats for Ness, pans for Paula, and assorted BB guns for Jeff. Oh, I guess he also gets actual rocket launchers, but for the most part, guns. These are funky weapon types you normally don't see, and it adds to the heaps of originality and personality Earthbound is exuding, but this has nothing to do with the progression. Gear is linear, leveling is linear, story is linear, and progress as a whole is linear. All this can be overlooked and forgiven if the combat system does enough with what it is given. So how about that combat system? If you have ever heard anyone talk about Earthbound's combat system, you will hear about one thing: the rolling health. This is a system in combat where if you take damage, your health rolls downward at a steady rate while you are still able to take actions. Normally in RPGs, as soon as an attack registers, you take the damage and go from there. Sure, you have some edge cases like Bloodborne where you can heal back some of the damage you take if you're fast enough, but like I said, these are edge cases. In terms of ideas to spice up the JRPG genre in the 90s, this one is up there. The only problem is it's nearly irrelevant for half of the game. Call this Limp Bizkit, the way this bitch just be rolling. It goes so fast that no matter how nimble your little gamer bitch fingers are, you will never be able to heal in time to stop the rolling health in the early game. You just don't have the pool of health required to pull this off consistently. By about the halfway point, when you have more members in your party to spread the damage out and more health required to roll, this becomes more viable, but even then it's tricky, which is how it should be. I think the best way this could have been implemented is to either reduce the speed at which it rolls, or have the speed be relative to your health. So if it rolled like 10% of your health within certain timed intervals, this would have worked way better than just having a set rate that steamrolls most characters a good way into the game. I mean, like, even Paula at the end melted quickly if an attack landed at the wrong time, and it was such a bummer that this wasn't a little bit better implemented, because it truly is genius. It causes you to hasten the speed at which you act in order to get the right moves off in time, and this leads to tangible skill improvement with the system itself. Goop, 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 goop. They did go on to change the rolling rates in Mother 3, but I'm playing Earthbound, which did not do that. As for the rest of combat, well, there's a reason that rolling health is always at the center of these conversations. Imagine a JRPG from the 80s, 90s in your head. Yep, that's Earthbound. You have regular attacks, items, and your magic, in this case PSI. Same principles, magic requires a resource but is much stronger, and physical attacks do less but you can consistently do them. Within magic you also have status effects, but I can count on one hand how many times you actually should use this, and Earthbound falls into the annoying category of RPGs that give you status effect moves but make bosses immune to them. If you use status effects on enemies, sorry, but you're a dipshit. It's a waste of SP, and if you do need to use SP on an enemy, just use a damaging PSI move. The only other PSI move that is useful is teleport, but that's not even in combat, so I don't know why I'm talking about it. There are some PSI moves that have different quote-unquote elements to each, but I genuinely did not even notice a major difference between them, besides lightning, which hits random enemies rather than targeted ones, which is donkey ass. It's not even stronger than the other PSI attacks, so I genuinely have no clue why you would actually use this outside of seeing the animation once or twice. The best part of combat is the battle themes, which all fucking rip, but again, that's presentation rather than combat. I think combat could have been saved if you just had more characters that felt uniquely distinct. Like this combat system, it's not all that different from the Final Fantasies of the time, but Final Fantasy benefited from having characters who each had distinct roles within combat. In this game you have Ness, the jack of all trades, Paula, the mage, I guess, who isn't even as strong as Ness with PSI, she just has a bigger pool of mana. Jeff, who either exclusively uses items or his shitty little gun until you invent the heavy bazooka at the end, which actually makes him usable, and Pooh, who is also magic user number 2. So, 2.5 magic users, 1.5 physical attackers. Yippee. And that's at the very, very end, not even throughout most of the game. Most of the game you only have 2 or 3 companions, so mark 1 or 2 of those off the chalkboard at any given moment. Again, to reiterate, I was never not having fun during combat, but the reason combat was enjoyable at all was the generational soundtrack, the weird psychedelic patterns of the combat background, and the resource management. Never was it the combat itself. Bosses were great, but they were great for the same reasons I mentioned, minus the resource management. At bosses, you actually get to unload all of your stored PSI and items, so it felt good to finally let loose and use all the tools given to you. To jerk the presentation off again, these boss designs were great. Bosses like Frank, the Sanctuary Guardians, that sick genie boss, or even the Diamond Dog look great. Oh my god, I just realized the Diamond Dog is a Bowie reference. I'm a bozo! Again, another 60s influence though. They look amazing and these fights were fun, and actually pretty challenging, but again, I'm not sure if I can chalk any of those good characteristics up to the combat. Final complaint is the final phase of the boss fight. Pray? Are you fucking serious? I had to try this boss 3 times because I had no clue how to beat it, just to search it up on the internet and find out you have to pray a certain amount of times to beat Gigas. Listen, I get story-wise the significance of this, or the hyper-specific circumstances where you are somehow out of mana and items with Paula, but you're also somehow not dead yet, so you choose to fuck around and hit pray over attack and then find this out, but that's dog shit. And I wish there was some earlier explanation as to why the fuck you would pray during the final boss fight, or why you would ever use pray in the entire game, but this is nitpicky. I don't know, I feel like I've said my piece on combat. Actually, I got one more piece. Critical hits feel real good. I mean, real fucking good. Maybe the best of any RPG I've played, but my fucking tongue is getting raw from repeating this. That is also largely in part due to the presentations. But screw it, might as well mention it. I'll give it to the combat. Overall, for the wider combat picture, I do not hate it, but I don't love it, and it is probably my least favorite part of Earthbound. For the final section, we have the companions. There is Ness, Paula, Jeff, and Pooh. They're all pretty shallow if I'm gonna be real. Designs are super memorable and iconic, but that's about all there is to them. Sure, they might have some story beats here and there, which I will cover, but for the most part, they're just extra firepower for fights. Still, let's rank them in order of enjoyment from least favorite to favorite. In last place is Pooh. His name is Pooh. Earthbound is really good at balancing occasional immature humor with mature humor, but this one's a big miss. Like this is the quirky, chungus, cringy type of humor that usually Earthbound was a lot better at avoiding, but here we are at Pooh, the foreign kung fu master from like fake India. His story is fine. I really like the trial he underwent, and the city he hails from looks gorgeous, and it's unique outside of everything else you would expect in this game. The reason he is last on the list is that you get him so late into the game. Even if that wasn't the case, he kind of feels like a repeat of Ness, a mixed physical psychic character who can only really use his PSI Starstorm, which is a nuclear level attack, but you really only use it on bosses because of the insane SP requirement. The rest of the time he is just a weak regular attacker, which blows. He also gets less benefit from normal items besides water, which he gets increased benefit from. Oh my god, I forgot to bitch about the inventory system. Sidebar. The inventory system is the most shit-filled, crusty, piss-stained toilet bowl you can imagine. Holy shit, I'm gonna have a panic attack. I hated having to adjust my fucking inventory all the goddamn time. I probably spent a non-significant amount of hours juggling these stupid fucking inventories, which were always filled a quarter of the way with these stupid fucking quest items you just had to have. Constantly changing backpacks, dropping items, calling item storage. So annoying. Back to Pooh though. I just don't feel a close connection to him as I did with the others, and he does not do enough to make up for how late we get him. Also, he just dips the fuck out of the party after receiving him, leaving the player with even less overall time for him. He honestly feels like the most tacked on part of Earthbound, but I don't hate him, his inclusion just confuses me a bit. Next up is Jeff. Look, I dig Jeff's drip and swag, I just don't entirely dig Jeff. He can be the most busted character, but that's only if you have the appropriate items. This would normally be whatever, but these items aren't even unique to Jeff. Anyone can use a bomb. The only thing Jeff can do that's unique is to fix broken items, but every single time these are just useless junk that you hold on to thinking you'll eventually use only to never use them. Or they'll just be weapons for Jeff. So to get good weapons for Jeff and make him viable, you have to lug heaps of trash around until you luck out on one of your rests and Jeff actually gets off his fucking ass and fixes them. Pretty annoying honestly, and most of the time Jeff is just auto-attacking, which is super weak compared to what any PSI user can do. During bosses, he can be super strong if you choose to use your best items, but again, any character could theoretically do this job, so it's not like this makes Jeff unique. He's the only character who is useless without them, so he uses them. Jeff with no rockets in his inventory? I'd rather have the dog at the beginning of the fucking game. Story-wise, he's good. I love his introductory mission at the Boys Academy and his brutally awkward relationship with his father, but I don't really get a sense of his personality. He's not like an autistic hyper nerd from the gist I got, but he's also not a regular boy. He's just kind of there, so that's why he is here. Oh, I do like the gay crush his friend has on him. That's a cute part of the story. Also, that's not me being facetious. The director of the game actually came out and clarified that Tony is gay. Wait, Next is Paula. Once again, not really much to her besides the fact that she is psychic and probably the overall best magic user in the game. She is roughly as physically strong as a polio-inflicted child, but she's invaluable to the party for her PSI. Paula also has the best background of any companion you meet, as you get a look into her life, her family and her as a person, and her impact on her community. She psychically communicates with Ness from the very beginning, and it just feels like you have an actual connection with her, rather than her being some random dipshit who just tagged along. She suffers from a lack of personality, but beggars can't be choosers, I suppose. I also really like the blue cult thing you have to save her from, and she definitely feels the most developed within the story. Having the final part of this game being Ness walking her back home feels like the perfect way to cap off this wild adventure. And at numero uno, you guessed it, it's Ness. Combat-wise, he is goated, being just as effective on trash mobs as he is on bosses. Story-wise, he is okay. He does actually get some kind of character development at the end of the game, and it makes a concerted effort to separate ourselves as the player from Ness. For most of the game, he kind of serves as a random self-insert, but seeing Ness's background and the scene with his family during his birth made me surprisingly emotional. Just the words from his dad talking about how he doesn't need Ness to live up to any expectations, but rather be happy with himself is so simple yet so poignant. I notice I keep referencing scenes with Ness's father, even though he takes up like 0.1% of the screen time, so let me clear the air. Yes, I do have daddy issues. Moving on. This entire zone and aspect to Ness definitely made me look at him in a different light, and I just kinda wish we had more scenes like this, or at least a similar scene with the other companions, but here we are. Definitely my favorite of the cast, and most importantly, Smash Bros. Main for life, bitches. So that's Earthbound. If this was a vibes-based tier list, Earthbound would be S+. Genuinely number one. Experiencing this game and playing through it gives you a feeling like no other game I've played. It's unique in substantial ways, it's surprisingly touching in others, and it's the king of atmosphere. However, I do notice a singular problem when talking about Earthbound. Earthbound is one of those games that is S+ in your memory. Thinking back on it now and thinking back on it the first time I played it both fill me with waves of nostalgia. Then there's the act of playing it, and you realize this is one of those games that's at its best in your memory. When you analyze this game, you analyze the vibe, the feelings you encounter when playing it, and the immaculate tone you receive throughout the playtime. You forget about the jokes that don't land, the frustrating sections that take years off your life, and the impurities that get lost to time in your memory. Rating this game is tough. I struggled trying to think of where to place this. Earthbound is an example of why rating games and comparing games is such a futile effort. How do you quantify the feeling you get? D+, no, I'm kidding. Look, I struggled back and forth on placement. I think I've settled on an A-. Even though A- might feel low, I want to emphasize the tier it stands in. This game is easily in the same discussion as Chrono Trigger, and 110% a must-play game that I would beg any fan of JRPGs to check out. It just falls a bit short of reaching the S tier despite easily filling the presentation criteria to do so. That's enough explaining and expanding. Let's move on to the final game.
Arythmos 20.
Tactics Ogre, Let Us Cling Together. Tactics Ogre is a tactical role-playing game developed and published by Quest Corporation for the Super Nintendo in 1995. Tactics Ogre is kind of the forefather of tactical RPGs, as we're familiar with them today. Sure, if you want to get in the nitty-gritty, it's not the first tactical RPG, but it is the progenitor of the many associations we make with the genre currently. Turn-based, top-down, with an isometric grid, where you control the movement of individual units on a set map. I mean, Triangle Strategy released in 2022 with the exact same staples I just listed, and Tactics Ogre predates that by roughly 30 years. All this to show how truly innovative and important Tactics Ogre is to the landscape of an entire subgenre of RPGs, one of which we have quite literally covered in this very video. Look, I'm not going to sit around pretending like that game doesn't exist and it isn't important to the context of this game. Final Fantasy Tactics? Never heard of it. Of course, these two games' histories are tied intrinsically to one another, mainly due to being the brainchild of the same man, Yasumi Matsuno. You son of a bitch, get back in here. Matsuno is the director, designer, and writer of both Final Fantasy Tactics and Tactics Ogre, so of course it would be silly to attempt to look at Tactics Ogre without acknowledging the eventual creation of FF Tactics, which would go on to dwarf the impact of Tactics Ogre. For all intents and purposes, Final Fantasy Tactics is the spiritual successor to Tactics Ogre. Nowadays, there are many people who know of Final Fantasy Tactics or have played it, but the number of people who are even aware of Tactics Ogre is vastly smaller despite it being held in high critical regard among the devoted, as evidenced by its inclusion on this top 100 list. So while I don't want to play this or that with every single aspect regarding Ogre versus Final Fantasy, I think there are important distinctions to point out where concepts are expanded upon in FF Tactics, and some of which are done better or dropped before the inception of that game. In terms of the ways to play this game in the modern era, there are a few ways. One is the tried and true method of playing it on the original physical console of the Super Nintendo, or you could play the PSP remake. Of course, you could also emulate it, but I know the good citizens in this audience would never even consider such a thing, unless they owned a physical copy. However, the most tangible and probable way most people experience Tactics Ogre in the modern era is with Tactics Ogre Reborn, a remaster of the PSP remake which released for all modern software in 2022. This is also the version I used and recorded. In terms of differences, there are a few additional characters, a few additional scenes, a slew of balancing changes which many argue changes the entire battle system. When it comes to which version to play, I always try to play whatever version I can legally play, which is why I settled on Reborn, despite many comments alluding to this being vastly different experience than the one that shares the same story. These differences include strength of various classes, the introduction of buff cards which serve as buffs for the units that pick them up, and the implementation of a level cap per zone to prevent overleveling and brute forcing encounters. Again, there are many people who argue that these are flat improvements, and many who argue that this completely ruins the game, just depends on who you ask. There are many debates online if that conversation interests you, but per the fact that the only legal way to play this is through this version, I'm just going to assume that is indeed how most people are going to play it. Just keep in the back of your mind that some complaints or positives I mentioned may be due to the Reborn changes rather than the OG Tactics Ogre experience. Okay, enough caveating and beta maxing, let's jump into the game.
Somebody once told me.
The story. Tactics Ogre takes place in the fictional kingdom known as Valyria, which has just undergone the trauma of losing its beloved King Dulgair. With no direct heirs, 3 separate ethnic groups devolve into a giant civil war that divides a once unified nation into an amalgamation of separate territories ruled by separate rulers. We have the foreign nation of Lotus, the Galgastans, and the Walsta, also known as the Wallastans. Long story short, the Wallastans got their shit rocked by the other nations and are now on top of the suffrage totem pole, facing the most direct racism and the smallest amount of power due to their ruler being captured and sentenced to death. This leaves random ragtag resistance groups that are fighting to gain their nation back from the other oppressive forces, and that's where a particular story starts. We follow Denim, his sister Kachua, and his dipshit hot-headed friend Vice as they plot an attack against an incoming militia who they believe belong to Lotus, only to find they're traveling mercenaries for hire. They aid our cause and help rescue the Walsta leader, Duke Ronway, from his death sentence, and thus we are now entrenched in an all-out war for the future of the Wallastans and for the future of all Valyria. The story is at its best when it's laying out the various actors involved within this story and establishing the moving parts that are going to affect the entirety of Valyria. In short, the politicking. I should also note that a really cool aspect about this game is the various routes throughout the story. There are 3 main routes in the game: the Chaos, Neutral, and Law routes, with a very non-insignificant difference between each. They are pretty radically different stories that may have the same main story beats, but vary drastically in how you get there. And even within these 3 routes, there are minor decisions you can make which alter the exact outcome and ending you achieve. In the remakes, you have the ability to actually track each of these possible decisions and can continue from those anchor points, which is really cool if you want to see every single outcome without playing an entirely new game. I went the Law route, which after watching story recaps and the various cutscenes I missed, I have to say I think is the strongest story route, but just keep in mind this story can vary drastically, and I can only really speak to the Law route, so my positives and negatives will revolve around this story path. So let's get into them. Let's start off with the negatives. Spoilers ahead, so be warned. My biggest problem with the Law route is the decision to massacre the group of civilians to bolster support for your cause. Let me be clear. I thought the concept behind this is fucking phenomenal. What a shit position to be put in, and what a tough decision to have to make, if it was built up better. If there was a genuine reason to do something like this, then you would have to weigh the lives of a group of captured slaves who refused to join the resistance versus the greater Valyria. This would be a brutal moral dilemma to decide upon. However, the decision is just so ridiculous. Like, there is quite literally no logical reason why you would ever agree to do this despite it leading to the best story, the Law route. If it was established that Duke Ronway was a completely good guy who genuinely has the best interests of Walsta in mind, they could have helped the case being made for going through with this insane plan. Instead, we already see from other cutscenes that he is already acting unhinged and is losing it. Or, it could be more forgivable if it was established that Denham is some sort of fucking drooling invalid, but we see he is quite calculated and has even been informed into the Duke's dwindling sanity, so there is just no reason to ever side with him. I get the broader point is to maybe headcanon that Denham implicitly trusts the judgment of the ruler, so I guess you could make the argument that the Nazis did of just following orders, but as I have said, Denham has already challenged the Duke's shitty ideas, so it just leads to this weird turn face. I think a final solution, to this problem would be if the Duke does this separately on his own, and you are informed about his actions at a later date, and then have to make the decision to continue along with him or his army, or to abandon him. By making you the person to decide if it does or doesn't happen, it just makes it such a comically easy moral question to answer. If you choose not to slaughter the innocent rescued slaves, they are killed anyway and the Duke lays the blame on you, leading you to form a resistance group to resist the resistance, aka the Chaos route. You can also go this route and then rejoin the Duke, which is what the neutral route is, but just the Law route itself and getting there is my problem. And yes, I get it, you control the buttons you press. But considering everything else with the Law route is so well done, it just sucks that they couldn't hammer home a better reason to force the player to press that button. The cherry on top of this integral moment in the story is the fact that massacring the civilians doesn't even lead to any benefits. Which, yeah, no fucking duh. The reasoning is stupid, the outcome is stupid, and the inclusion of this is stupid. Like I said, if they kept this same moral dilemma but went back to the drawing board to restructure the circumstances under which you have to make this choice, I would be much more receptive, but for what's here, it just kinda sucks. Also, quick sneak in for the second negative, your sister's character, just abysmal dog shit. Spoiler, she eventually leaves your campaign because you're not paying enough attention to her while you're waging your war. I wish I was exaggerating, but this is quite literally what happens. Then you have the option to accept her back once you beat her in a boss fight, or be cruel to her, which causes her to commit suicide. I spared her, but I now genuinely regret this. Kinda wish I just straight up said fuck you to her because Jesus Christ, she's awful. Kind of a bad, clearly unhinged ruler, so oopsie I guess. Now for the positives. Despite writing itself into some bad corners in order to set up moral dilemmas, the way in which this war is portrayed is so well done. The depravity that both sides undertake in order to fight for their ideals is brutal. Obviously the Duke is no saint, but the people he's fighting against are also equally unhinged and waging a brutal oppressive occupation against an entire ethnic group due to purely bad blood reasons. I also like the way Tactics Ogre portrays the warping and changing that occurs during war. The initial enemy you face isn't even one of the main factions you wage war against in the long run, and you find yourself mainly trying to fight the resistance group which is now resisting you. The game even recognizes the insane reality of the situation, with multiple scenes boiling down to what the fuck are we even fighting for and why the fuck are we fighting our own kin? It's such a realistic, mature approach to a story of war where there is no clear good guy, bad guy dynamic, that is until the end. And it just causes you to feel 100 times more invested in the story because you want to see how it all unfolds. Each side has their own valid reasons for going to war, but that doesn't make either one of them justified. It portrays the sloppiness of conflict, and being part of a nation waging a war adds to this feeling of powerlessness as you have to just kind of follow suit with whatever side you're on. This is one aspect I think Tactics Ogre does better than Final Fantasy Tactics. In Final Fantasy, you're a lone wolf rebel group with no real ties to any side of the conflict, so it's way easier to chase ideals and do what Ramza thinks is morally righteous. In Ogre, having actual skin in the game completely changes the dynamic of the power vacuum story, and you are forced to put your weight behind a single nation with its own heaping of baggage, and I think it is all handled really well. And if you do go the Chaos route, many of your friends and companions die just by going this route, which reinforces this idea that in war you cannot have it all. You are either moral, leading to the death of many you love and an overall lack of power in the global sphere, or you give up some of your morals in order to make true change, but coming out at the end a vastly different person. Just really well done, and provides an outlook on war that is not so black and white in context of your own character's actions. Since it is a fantasy RPG, however, of course there is a supernatural tint to the story which rears its head at the end. Despite absolutely loving the final boss fight, I think the setup wasn't great. Kind of comes from left field and drags away from the quite real human stakes that have been established in the main story. By having the weird demon resurrection thing, I feel like it simplifies a painful reconciliation that would have had to have been made between warring factions, which just cheapens the conflict. I think Final Fantasy Tactics handled its supernatural aspect much better, but I've already yapped for far too long on the story, so let's just leave it at that and move on. Oh, also, and it, gave me the opportunity to go, oh, so that's what an ogre is.
Ogre, 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 ogre.
Now for the presentation. Frankly, I am not a fan of this presentation of this game at all. Let's start with the look. I understand this is a slightly updated version of the original, but frankly, I think the original on Super Nintendo looks just as mid, maybe with just slightly better shading. Everything has this blurry outline to it, and the entire look of the game feels super muddy. Character portraits are absolutely phenomenal and add so much life to the characters, but their sprites cancel this positive out by just looking super out of place compared to the detailed and realistic portraits. Menus are just heaps of information with seemingly little thought as to how to actually organize information in a way that is digestible. The designs of monsters and enemies are cool, but lack any sort of special attributes to make them truly stand out in my head. Thinking back, all I can remember is the multitude of different elemental dragons, the skeletons, and the lizard dudes, of which I only remember because one was a mainstay in my army. Character designs aren't bad, they just aren't as striking and memorable as other TRPGs. They kind of all blend together in my mind in terms of design, save for a few standouts like the Terror Knight and the Barbarian. I don't even remember what the ninja looked like in this game. The ninja! Speaking of blending together, let's talk about the soundtrack. This soundtrack is the most soundtrack that has ever soundtracked. If I told you to imagine a medieval army video game soundtrack, you have now probably heard 50% of the tracks in this game. The only tracks I even slightly remember are due entirely to them sounding like other more famous soundtracks, like the one boss theme that sounds exactly like Duel of the Fates or the Pokemon sounding one. Again, I want to emphasize, I never heard a track that sucked me out of the game or any that I would consider bad, but it all just seemed so milquetoast and lacked any of its own true identity. I'm not saying every video game needs some off-the-wall unique soundtrack like Earthbound, but it definitely goes a long way to help that game stand out versus Tactics Ogre, which comes off as too run-of-the-mill. There were many times in this game where I would just mute my TV and listen to podcasts, whereas with other games on this list, even the thought of doing that would be hearsay. I do understand this is an older game and it's easy to forget that due to how innovative other aspects of this game feels, but there are plenty of older innovative games that went the extra distance to make themselves stand out on the presentation front, and unfortunately, Tactics Ogre is not one of them. I did like a couple tracks, and listening back on the soundtrack, I do recognize the songs in here. They just don't stick in my head like many great themes do. Editor's note: I listened to the Super Nintendo version, and maybe it's the monkey brain nostalgia in me, but god damn it, that one feels way better. The sounds and instruments they use fit much better, and it blows my mind why that wasn't even an option to play on Reborn. I don't know what the freaking fuck they were thinking by at least not giving the option to play the OG soundtrack, like the way that Final Fantasy Pixel Remasters give you the same option, but fuck my butt, I suppose. Definitely would say I like the SNES way more, but most of you goofballs would probably also only play the Reborn edition, so oops, I guess. Lost to history, I suppose. Map designs and layouts are pretty good. Like, they all get the job done. I just wish there were more like the final battle, which seems way different from any other environments we find ourselves in. Some highlights for me were the battles that took place during snow and in the winter, or the crazy ass mountains you had to fight on, which led to challenging fights. But outside of that, it's the typical castles and forests you would expect. Some of the beasts you fight and recruit are kind of fun and unique, like the octopus, which is just a really funny character to control. Same goes for Cyclops, but these are pretty rare, and most of the enemies you find yourself fighting are just other enemy units. None of these looked weird or off-putting, but they did lack some of the charm and recognizability that Final Fantasy Tactics jobs had. It also helps that there were far less jobs and classes in Final Fantasy Tactics, whereas there are a fucking kajillion in this game, which led to me getting confused as to which is which and what does what. To this day, I don't know the difference between a warlock and a wizard, and I refuse it to look it up. That's how they win. You know who I'm talking about. Gamers. I'll talk more about the classes and progression, but as far as presentation goes, they're fine. The final piece I want to talk about is the controls and quality of life added in the Reborn version. Controls are fine. Changing the camera angle to top down is fucked, and I would constantly accidentally do this, but chalk it up to skill issue, I guess. No way to rotate the camera either, which I understand with the original Super Nintendo version, but really? You couldn't add that in the remake. What is added in Reborn is the chariot system. The chariot system lets you rewind back a couple of turns, and it was quite nice to have, mainly in case you accidentally moved to the wrong spot or to cheese recruitment, and I wish more tactics game implemented a system similar to this. I know you could argue this leaves room for the system to be abused, but I never really used it to ease difficulty, rather just to fix mistakes brought on by clunky old game design. All in all, I think the presentation is just meh, bordering on bad. I get it obviously is not the main focus of what this game was going for, but I think putting a little bit more focus on this aspect of the game would have gone a long way.
Oh, this is precious. The ogre!
Now for progression. Progression is fine. I think something that threw me off with this game is that I expected it to be a true predecessor to Final Fantasy Tactics, but its systems are actually vastly different, besides sharing a common root. There is no real character progression in this game. Yes, in typical RPG fashion, at certain levels you unlock new abilities and skills, but this is all class dependent rather than character. So for example, there are no skills that carry over if I switch the class of a character. The only carryover ability in Tactics Ogres are the weapon skills, which are skills you unlock by using a certain weapon for an extended period of time. This is sort of interesting, but frankly you're going to be using the weapon that's available to the class you have equipped, so it's not like this leads to some interesting character building. Most characters are going to choose a single class and stick with it, so there's no real choices to be made about what weapon you want to use, save for the initial choice. Plus, weapon skills really aren't all that. Look, they are nice to have as it leads to additional options, but I would not necessarily consider these game changers. Most abilities you will be using are going to be the class ones, and the various abilities between weapons all pretty much amount to the same thing, a more powerful weapon attack that costs MP. Don't get me wrong, again, they're really nice to have on hand, but the cost of MP on top of the fact that most classes have a better use for their MP just kind of makes them redundant. Progression of classes, however, are pretty decent. The customization comes into play through having limited ability slots, so you have to choose which ability should be equipped for each class. This sounds super interesting, but really each class has their own unique abilities, which in most instances will be the ones you equip. You have a plethora of generic abilities that are class-less, but none of these are particularly good or interesting, so they often just go unequipped. Having choices like this are good to have. I just wish there were more viable abilities which would make this choice interesting. I think the leveling curve is great, with each class having a good spread of when you gain your abilities, leading to level progression feeling natural. Every new ability unlocked always felt like it helped my character without causing them to feel overpowered, and each character felt like it provided the appropriate support in battle. Sure, some classes did more than others, but none felt like it had a monopoly on my focus, nor did any feel useless. This is helped by the level cap added by the Reborn edition, which keeps each zone level capped so you can't overlevel enemies. This is a good and bad aspect for Tactics Ogre. Good that it ensures combat is challenging throughout the entire game, but bad because it really does suck to go through an entire fight just to see a big fat 0 experience gain. That feeling blows, and I can't help but feel a scaled experience would have been a much better choice, but this is entirely personal. Every gamer has their own preference as to how to handle this. I just prefer a scaled cap if a cap has to be implemented. Difficulty is okay. I never particularly struggled at any moment in the game, but there are a few tough fights in here that took me a couple tries, like the 1v3, a couple of the endgame bosses, and the final fight. Maybe I'm just a fucking gigalord gamer, but it feels odd to implement a level cap and the challenge still feels this muted. Like, what's the point? Online, people seem to think this game is fairly difficult, so maybe I'm just cracked or something, I don't know, but I just never really struggled. The story progression is great. I think key details and plot points are perfectly spread throughout, and each act's ending felt impactful. Also, the multiple paths and routes through this game add such replayability, and it was rather ahead of its time in regards to branching story paths based off of choice. Considering this is a 40 to 50 hour game, the story felt like it was perfectly tailored. What wasn't perfectly tailored are the fights. Jesus H. Christ. Some of these fights took me, no joke, 45 minutes. I remember thinking in Final Fantasy Tactics that I wish I was able to use more of my units in battle. And this game made me realize how dog shit of an idea that was. I completely see why they lowered unit count in Final Fantasy, because it just leads to giant slogfests. Luckily in Reborn Edition you can 4x the speed, it's just unfortunate I did not discover this feature until about halfway through the game. Then that bitch never came off. So yeah, progression is good, not much else to add.
You there! Ogre!
Now for combat. First, let's get this out of the way. While I am glad to have played Final Fantasy Tactics and Tactics Ogre in the same time frame, there are some negatives that come with this as well. The biggest one is preconceptions. I came into Tactics Ogre expecting Final Fantasy Tactics Lite, but their combat systems are actually insanely different. Yes, Tactics Ogre is the precursor to Final Fantasy Tactics, but their entire combat system is night and day. Final Fantasy has a focus on character building and implementing these builds into your units, and then having small-scale battles with no more than a handful of enemy units at a time. Each unit is distinct and wholly different from one another, with greater emphasis on each unit due to the fact that there are less of them on the board at any given time. Think of this as chess. If you and your opponent have 5 pieces that you can customize with other chess pieces' attributes, playing against one another instead of typical chess pieces. So, chess but nothing like chess. Tactics Ogre is more akin to a regular game of chess. Many units on the screen at once that come as they are, with each unit's differences being far more subtle and less obvious. In Final Fantasy, losing a single unit can drastically sway the tides of battle, so it's like a fast-paced boxing match between two heavyweights. Tactics Ogre is much more methodical with slower pacing. You need to surround enemy units and pick off the weaker ones, one by one until your numbers vastly outweigh your opponents and you can finish the job. Taking down a single unit is a team affair, and positioning of your entire squad is much more important than Final Fantasy Tactics, where the emphasis on positioning is on the individual unit. I totally see why these two games are divisive, and why there are so many who love one and hate the other. Their approaches to combat could not be more different. If you're a bigger fan of strategy, you probably prefer Tactics Ogre, and if you're more of a fan of character building, you probably prefer Final Fantasy. This is an example of why I got to play them so close to one another, despite the obvious negatives that may come with it. As for basics though, combat is identical to the system I described in Final Fantasy. You move units one at a time, choose an ability, item, or attack, and then choose the direction your unit is facing, with the same negatives and benefits to positioning, i.e. back attacks do more damage, side is neutral, front is less. The biggest difference in basics is the auto abilities and buff cards. The auto abilities are abilities that are randomly triggered at the start of one's turn and can either boost SP gains, cause statuses such as haste, or other various positive benefits. Buff cards are random cards that appear on tiles that give boosts to the character that picks them up. These boosts can be attack damage, magic damage, percent chance of proccing an auto ability, or crit chance, and all buff cards are stackable. There are also rare cards that can remove all buffs, and even the playing field if your opponent has managed to stack buffs on a particularly nasty unit, and rare cards that permanently boost a stat for a unit that picks it up. I never really noticed individual stats for my units, so I don't know how important this aspect is to each character, but I always grabbed them when I got the chance. Buff cards were added by Reborn, and I'm torn on them. Random chance such as this feels odd to include in a strategy game, but it does prevent you from simply bunching together your units and not spreading out. It can also make things interesting, but not particularly strategic, so I think it's kind of a wash on if this was a good or bad addition. I would say, overall I enjoyed the combat of Tactics Ogre. It's just important to know what you are getting into when playing. Units feel less distinct from one another, and many of these classes just feel like the same unit with 1 or 2 deviations. Valkyrie Knights are knights that use lances and magic. Wizards only use magic. Knights are the tanks, archers are ranged, and every other single class is a play on one of these archetypes. Of the 10 units you can deploy at one time, many of them have drastic overlaps amongst one another, and it leads to every recruit feeling much less unique to use. With Final Fantasy Tactics, I find it hard to imagine I would ever use a similar composition from playthrough to playthrough. But with Tactics Ogre, I find it hard to imagine I would stray too far from what I used in this playthrough. Again, some people love this about Tactics Ogre and find the strategy the engaging part of combat rather than the units themselves. I just find myself wanting something more to dig my teeth into for Tactics Ogre. It also doesn't help how much shit you have to go through to get the truly unique gear and fun equipment. In Final Fantasy Tactics, there was a 10-floor optional dungeon that I happily engaged with due to how fast battles were and how much I enjoyed the process of leveling up jobs and allocating JP points to build my favorite character. In this game, some of the best gear is hidden in a 99-floor dungeon. Fucking Epstein's Island doesn't have 99 floors. How the fuck does this Gooner Cave have so much real estate? It really is just a giant super dungeon that I had no interest in pursuing, and bluntly speaking, I don't know if I would have even gone through it if it was 10 floors like Final Fantasy. I don't mean to imply I don't like the combat in this game, but by the end point, I was pretty much at my limit as to what I was getting out of this game, whereas with Final Fantasy Tactics, I was begging for more. I get the appeal of this combat system and would consider myself a fan of it, but I don't think I would say with my entire chest that I loved it.
Ogres don't celebrate Christmas.
Final section is the characters/companions. I don't really know what classifies as what, so I'll just go through a little of both and elaborate on them in no particular order. First is Denim. I'm conflicted with Denim. As I said in the story section, his character's actions in the law route make absolutely no sense. So much so that later down the line, when other characters demand a reason for why he would ever go along with the innocent civilian slaughter, the game doesn't even attempt to fart out some vague reason. He's just silent in these encounters, and it added to my frustration with the handling of that scene. Even the writers couldn't justify his actions. All of that aside, however, I loved his character. To see him grow from a cautious and hopeful young squire into a pretty ruthless leader is great, and I like how he does not pull punches. He is pretty brutal to those who betrayed him, including his own sister who he reprimands, and the same goes for Weiss. I do think this game teeters between him being an innocent, epic little guy and a ruthless civilian slaughterer a little too much, but his growth is what's impressive about his character, and it shows that well when it wants to. Next is Koshua. You know how I feel about her. Such a dogshit character turn that made absolutely no sense. No build-up, no real reason, just an awful choice to take her character. Plus, even before then, she was annoying as fuck, so fuck her. Next is Weiss. I know people hate Weiss because of the other routes, but within the realm of the law route, I quite liked his character. Having your friend become the person who creates the true moral rebel group is an interesting way to go, considering in most games these roles are reversed, i.e. Tactics with Ramza and Delita. Having Weiss have to put his completely valid qualms with you aside is heartwarming to see, and even at the very end, you can feel the fracture in a relationship that will never heal. He comes off as a mature character who has gone through his own growth absent of you, and I love that about this typical best friend character. Next is Canopus. He's fine. He's the snarky, smooth-talking rogue character. Nice. Not really much more to him besides this. He just feels like a random inclusion. I understand he was in a previous Ogre game, so maybe that would have helped my connection to him, but for what is provided within this game, he just comes off as an excuse to give the player a flying character early. He has some bonding scenes with Denim and a couple scenes where he busts Weiss's balls, but we never get a read into what he thinks and how he truly feels, so he comes up lacking overall. Speaking of characters from previous game, next we have Lancelot with the S. Yes, this will become important later. Lancelot is much better because he actually has some sort of development despite being absent from the player for much of the game. He is kind of the de facto parental figure for your group of rebellious youth and eventually is captured by Lancelot with an S. Told you it'd be important. And is brutally tortured into becoming a mute. I saw this thing on Reddit, I talked with my real life human being friends who told me that apparently in one of the endings you can wake him up from his catatonic state. But I did not get that one, so he's still vegging out in one of my save files. Rip Bozo. Next up is Ravness. I actually really like her character, and seeing the perspective of a deserter after the civilian massacre is a really important lens to view events through. She's rather tough to actually recruit, but if you do, it is well worth it. She kind of serves as a total outcast from every warring faction, and seeing her come to grips with the fact that she either allows herself to die helping nobody, or sacrifice a bit of her beliefs to enact real change is refreshing, if not a little depressing. I think just the act of fighting against her own kingdom, which she fought tooth and nail for, reveals so much about her character, and I quite like her, even if we only get a few glimpses into her personal story. Next we have Ozma and Hobrim, who I'm just gonna lump together. Hobrim is a cool class with Swordsmaster, and cool concept of being blind sword dude, but I don't really get much insight into him, so he just kind of feels like another class added to the roster. Albeit, Swordmaster is a sick-ass class, but still, he feels a little void of character. Ozma, on the other hand, is sick. An absolute demon in combat, and seeing part of her story from a Death Knight's perspective is really cool and unique. Did not enjoy her relationship with Hobrim because it came way out of left field and made absolutely zero sense, but hey, probably my most powerful character in combat. She was one of the bad guys, so fuck it. Last is Lancelot with an S. No goddamn clue why they included two Lancelot names, but who am I to say? Lancelot is pretty much the head honcho villain who hides in the shadows and waits for his chance to strike. He's fine. The only thing that I have a complaint is that this heel turn from the Death Knights is the most obvious thing in the world, because these characters quite literally look straight out of a Dragon Ball evil goon squad. Also, he does not come off as that intimidating because he doesn't really do anything that makes your character super dislike him. He just kind of plays both sides. Understand the ending implies they wanted to build on his character, but that never happened, so we're left with a disappointing villain-ish character. Neat that he summons the ritual titular ogre that only took the entire fucking game to reach, but still. Finally, I want to highlight Azulstan for no particular reason other than absolutely having that shit on. I mean, oh look at him. Dapper son of a bitch.
It's all ogre now.
So that's Tactics Ogre. Let us cling together. Boy oh boy, where do I start? Let's start here. It is undeniable the influence this game has had upon an entire genre. You can feel the DNA of an entire subgenre of RPG within the structure of this game, and that is no small feat. Many of the best RPGs of all time cannot attribute the creation of a genre to themselves, but Tactics Ogre can say it with its entire chest. However, influence doth not a good game make. Battles are extremely long and tenuous, with most outcomes being obvious within the first 10 minutes, only to spend the next 30 arriving at this inevitable conclusion. The story is my cup of tea, political and mature, but stumbles over the weight of its own writing and suffers from, let's say, puzzling choices. The presentation is dated in an unflattering way, and the changes made from the only realistic modern way to play this game, Reborn, are extremely hit and miss. Finally, the big fat chocobo in the room, Final Fantasy Tactics Existence, which makes the recommendation of this game even harder. But I did have a solid time playing this. I would never in a million years say I disliked this game, but I also struggle to admit that absent this list, I would have ever stuck with a game like this. I think I've arrived at a C+ in terms of how I would rate Tactics Ogre. Don't regret playing it, but I would be pretty agnostic to recommending it to anyone outside of massive TRPG enjoyers. Whew. 3.5 hours of recording, pre-edit. My voice is shot. Those are numbers 15 through 20 on the list of top 100 RPGs. What a fun change of pace in terms of games I've played for this channel. Got a good mix of many different subgenres and got to explore the quintessential tactical role-playing genre game, so that's pretty sweet. Let's look over the tier list real quick to show the new changes, all games being listed in order of enjoyment. Final Fantasy Tactics arrives at the top of S- tier, now occupying the spot that used to belong to The Witcher 3 before that was bumped up. Final Fantasy VI is now also in the same tier as alluded to in the intro. Earthbound is an A-. I personally think I enjoyed the presentation enough to justify bumping it above Mass Effect 2, which might anger the normies but kick rocks, nerds. Deus Ex is in B tier, and I would slide it right between Vagrant Story and KOTOR, which is now also in the B tier rather than the B- tier. Tactics Ogre is in C+ tier, right behind Avowed. While Tactics Ogre is undeniably going to be more important to the history of RPGs, I just have to admit I enjoyed playing Avowed from a moment-to-moment basis a tad bit more than Tactics, so that's why it's below. Then at the bottom of C tier, in the C- category, we have Suikoden 2. That's all the changes.
Editor's note: this section was recorded before the Hades 2 video came out, so it is outdated. Instead, I want to use this earfuck of a voiceover to let you know my next video will be in Is It Better Than for Pokemon Legends ZA. It was originally supposed to come out right after this video, but with the announcement of the Mega Dimensions DLC, I am going to wait for that release and do a comprehensive, all-encompassing video. Thanks for sticking through this clanker voiceover, and don't forget that I still do not have a signing off message. Get Jebaited Nerds 0707070707.